Angelica looked at the wedding photograph. She and Edward had been married for 3 years. Just think how quickly time flies. She looked at herself so happy in a wedding dress. She was distracted from her memories by the squeak of an SMS message. It was her husband reminding her that she needed to donate blood today. Then she received a notification about a bank transaction. Money had been received on her card. After 3 years of marriage, Edward writes to her only to supervise the blood donation, but not for himself, but for Ursula. Over the past month, the girl donated blood 3 times. This is much more than her body can bear. Yesterday, while she was waiting for him from work, she stood in the rain for more than an hour and now felt like she was feverish. A message arrived when Angelica took the phone, saw a photo of her husband and Ursula, where it was written that last night he was with her, and a note with humiliation that Edward had not looked at her as a woman in all 3 years, and she was an empty place. The phone beeped again, a voice message from the mother-in-law, who told her daughter-in-law to hurry up and prepare dinner, since the maid had a day off today. The girl could barely hold back her tears. Her husband's family treated her like a servant, and she endured everything for the sake of Edward. But this photo from Ursula was the last straw. It was the last kick to her self-esteem. As a result, the young woman picked up the phone and resolutely dialed her husband with the message that they were getting a divorce. In response to his words about what kind of circus she was organizing, Angelica said that if he was not at the registry office in an hour, Ursula would die. After she hung up, a message came about another replenishment of the card. Our heroine smiled. That's how he wants to keep her. An hour later, they were sitting in the registry office, where Edward could not understand why she was unhappy. Yes, she donated blood 3 times in a month, but he compensated her for this. Angelica understood that he was a loser. He really did not understand her pain and humiliation, and she resolutely demanded a divorce. What she regretted was the 3 wasted years. Edward hurried her that it was time to go to the hospital. The girl resolutely said that even if this trash died in front of her in the hospital, she would no longer give up a drop of her blood. Edward frowned and reproached her for such words, reminding her of the marriage agreement according to which she must donate blood at any time. The girl, grunting, resolutely left the building and headed to the car. Edward looked at her back and did not understand how she could change so much in a day. The nurse asked about Ursula's well-being. She smiled sweetly and answered that the wound hardly hurt, and she was much better. At that moment, Angelica entered the room with a determined look, followed by Edward. Looking ingratiatingly at Edward's wife, the patient babbled that she didn't expect to see her here today, but she needed her blood. Angelica, looking at her coldly, demanded an answer. It was she who sent the photo and SMS in the morning. Ursula looked confused and asked what photo she was talking about. At that moment, Angelica swung her hand and hit Ursula in the face. She screamed, distorted with anger. By what right did she behave this way towards her? Our heroine again began to resolutely approach the girl. Edward resolutely blocked her path and told her to stop immediately, while Ursula, sobbing, repeated that she had nothing to do with the photo. Angelica coldly threw the printed photos at Edward's face. The man took one of them and asked in surprise where his wife got them, while Ursula sat looking scared. Edward looked at Ursula menacingly, asking if she had anything to do with all this. He himself commented that yesterday he actually fell asleep in the ward because he was tired. Ursula tearfully said that she could swear on the name of Alex, his best friend, reminding Edward of the oath Edward made to his best friend in the army to take care of her. After these words, he turned to the girl and, putting his hand on her shoulder, asked her to calm down, assuring her that Angelica was just very worried, so she took it out on her. Turning to his wife, whom he divorced an hour ago, he said that he needed to quickly donate blood. The main thing was Ursula's health, and he could talk about the photo later. Smiling contentedly, Edward's ward thought that he was still choosing her, and Angelica was again in the air. When Angelica asked the doctor standing next to her whether the patient really needed a blood transfusion, she became nervous and nodded in the affirmative. He added that Miss Ursula had fallen, had wounds on her legs, and was in urgent need of a transfusion. Angelica thought about it and said that there was no need to rush so much. In 2 steps, she found herself at the patient's side and jerked back the blanket to reveal her bandaged leg. She fought back as best she could, but the young woman showed everyone a small abrasion by tearing off the bandage, mockingly adding that the wound was not even bleeding. Then she sarcastically added that she arrived in the ward too early. She just needed to walk a little, and everything would heal. Edward looked menacingly at Ursula, who made excuses that she was really sick and blood transfusions were helping her recover. Angelica, leaving the room, told them coldly, "Let them look for a new fool for a walking blood bank. She's had enough." The girl went out into the hospital corridor and tiredly sank down on the sofa. She was so exhausted how hard it was for her. Choking from tears, she dialed the number from which her older brother's painfully familiar voice answered her that he would pick her up soon. When Eugene arrived, his sister was sleeping on the hospital couch. The man carefully took his sister in his arms and, accompanied by guards, carried her, looking worried at how thin and pale she was. Accompanied by security, he carried her sleeping out of the hospital. At this time in the ward, Edward was talking to a noticeably nervous doctor, scolding him for this whole situation with a transfusion due to some kind of abrasion. Edward pondered the current situation and thought that he had indulged his ward too much. Apparently, his wife misunderstood his relationship with Ursula. He decided to explain himself and close this problem. If Angelica felt safer, he would keep his distance from Ursula. Going out into the corridor, he gave the order to his guards to find his wife. After 10 minutes, he was informed that Miss Angelica was nowhere to be found. Edward thought about it. She doesn't have a penny. She can't just pick up and leave. Then he ordered that his wife be found wherever she was and brought to him. The estate of Angelica's family was located in a picturesque place surrounded by cherry blossoms. The heiress opened her eyes in her room. She sat in bed and looked in front of her. There was such a pleasant and long-forgotten feeling of home. The girl began to cry, thinking that she had finally returned. Her parents entered the room. Angelica, with tears, rushed into her father's arms. The father looked at his child, who grew up in love and affection, and who gave 3 years to a man who did not value her at all, giving up her status as the heiress of a rich and high-ranking family. When the girl cried, her father reminded her of the agreement. If in 3 years she did not fall in love with Edward, she would take over her family's company. The returning daughter promised her father that she would not be the same as before. Her parents would be proud of her. Suddenly, she was almost knocked to the floor by a cheerful girl hugging and kissing her. It was Angelica's best friend, Martha. Martha, looking into her friend's eyes, said that Edward would regret exchanging pearls for fish eyes. The girls held hands as in childhood and smiled happily when Angelica noticed that there were documents left in her ex-husband's house that needed to be picked up. The grand family mansion was a gray, solid building, the complete opposite of the open and light mansion of the Angelica family with large windows. Martha volunteered to accompany Angelica. As soon as they entered, they were greeted by Angelica's ex-mother-in-law with an embittered face. The woman noticed that she was now a nobody here, a stranger, and therefore let her get out, just like Martha shamed the woman by hinting at her manners and upbringing. But Grace, that was the name of our heroine's mother-in-law, added with derogatory contempt that her former daughter-in-law was one of the non-entities who marry wealthy men. Angelica didn't have time to answer anything before Grace angrily said that she had been enjoying a luxurious life for 3 years for the money of Edward's family, although she herself was from a dysfunctional family, and finally called the girl a dirty beggar. Unable to restrain herself any longer, Martha jumped up to her. Grace wanted to slap her in the face, but the girl pushed her onto the sofa, shouting that her family was rich with dirty money, and this house was dirtying her and Angelica's shoes. The former daughter-in-law calmly walked towards the stairs, and Grace, distorted with hatred, screamed that she would throw her out of here. To which Angelica coldly snapped that she would do it herself as soon as she collected her things. Getting up, the girl cheerfully added, "What a fool she was, leaving her dignity for the sake of this family. If not for Martha, Grace was ready to chase her daughter-in-law." When the girls had collected the documents and left, Grace shouted that there was no turning back, even if she didn't dream, and said cheerfully that she had divorced her precious son. As soon as Edward stepped foot in the house, his mother immediately asked about the divorce. He stared at her in surprise and asked how she knew this. Having learned from his mother everything that had happened, Edward told his mother that the girl had not asked for a penny, to which the mother angrily remarked that someone like his now ex would not miss hers, which means she was hatching a plan to rob them. Edward sadly realized that his family hated Angelica, but he didn't even notice it. On the contrary, he believed that she was treated well, so maybe she filed for divorce because of his mother. Going up to the room, he saw her bank card, realizing that Angelica only took her things. At this time, his mother flew into the room screaming that the necklace called the Lost Dream was missing, and she knows that the thief is none other than this beggar woman whom they warmed up. While Grace was screaming that she would call the police, his gaze fell on their wedding photo with Angelica. The man realized that in 3 years of marriage, he had never given her jewelry. When Edward barked that his mother didn't dare call the police, she angrily said that she would deal with her without the police. At this time, Angelica and her friend, and they set a condition for returning it by tomorrow, or the police will arrive. Our heroine lay there and could not utter a word. Even from them, she did not expect such meanness. The girl read the news. They wrote about her as some kind of beggar who had never seen money. As a thief, the comments were full of gossip and speculation. Angelica interrupted the speaker, Martha, who, after another line, was typing her in anger and said that she would find a way to put an end to this gossip. She dialed Eugene and asked who runs their brother's entertainment company. Although the company is registered in her name, the relative wanted to help her sister, but she said that she would do everything herself. The next morning, posts appeared on the internet that a private detective had found out that a certain miss was wasting money in a world casino, and a photo of a girl in a casino and a necklace next to her. The young woman's gaze stopped at that photo on the phone, where her now ex-husband and this impudent person, a painful stabbing in her chest. Well, the next piece of information for the people is ready. The girl tiredly closed her eyes, thinking about how blindly she got married and who her husband really is. In the morning, Edward called an assistant and shouted indignantly at who dared to send the news on behalf of the company, to which the employee replied that according to the Hyung entertainment law, the news must be displayed for 24 hours. They cannot remove it before that. Edward could not understand how this was even possible, how his wife got such opportunities. He called his father and told him to delete the statement about the police. But on the phone, he heard his mother's screams. The screams of the mother continued, who shouted that if only this brat, that is his now ex-wife, would appear, and she would teach her a lesson. When Edward said that his wife was not to blame, she screamed hysterically that the girl had disgraced them all. Edward replied that he could just apologize. In the end, her mother accused her of stealing, but it was not her fault. Realizing that the relative could not be convinced, the man hung up and asked his people if they had found his wife, but received a negative answer. He flipped through his wife's posts, where she posted the idyll of their 3-year marriage. Here's breakfast, and this is him picking her up from work. At that moment, he realized that he didn't know her at all. While he was scrolling through his feed of posts, the images began to freeze, and then everything was deleted. He realized that his wife, already ex-wife, deleted the entire history for 3 years. 3 years of marriage were simply erased. He narrowed his eyes angrily, and looking out the window, hissed that he would get Angelica wherever they were. Edward walked arm in arm with Ursula, surrounded by crowds of people, journalists, camera flashes, but he is the head of a large corporation and is obliged to appear in society. He shook hands and uttered standard phrases. Meanwhile, Ursula held his arm and was incredibly happy. She was with him at such an event. Another luxury car drove up. Eugene got out. People began to whisper. And Edward, seeing that a woman was about to get out of the car, was surprised, since this gentleman had never been noticed with women before. What was Edward's surprise when he saw that the stranger was Angelica? She was magnificent. A luxurious black dress emphasized her graceful figure. Expensive jewelry added gloss. It was time to move on to the banquet, but he could not take his eyes off her. Surprise, admiration, some kind of internal fire engulfed the man. Angelica, looking at her ex-husband and his companion, thought how quickly she had gotten the hang of him. Seeing where his sister was looking, Eugene calmly said that his older brother was nearby, and there was no need to be afraid, to which the girl replied that it was not she who needed to be afraid. When Angelica and her brother caught up with Edward and Ursula, her ex shook hands with Eugene, noting that he had heard a lot about him and introduced himself. The president of a large corporation, Edward Grand, looked at his ex-wife, who behaved like a real aristocrat, amazed at her changes. Ursula watched her partner's gaze and realized that she could not lose him again because of this girl. Then she sarcastically added to Angelica what she was doing here. Such places were expensive, but she had no money. Her brother remarked that Miss Ursula must be the daughter of some boss, to which she stated that Angelique had recently divorced her Edward. Eugene besieged Ursula by noting that his companion, despite the divorce, is not prohibited from attending such events. Ursula was embarrassed and noticeably nervous, not knowing what to say. Angelica looked at her derogatorily and said that she had no idea that she needed to report on her movements to anyone, much less to her. As a result, Edward, with downcast eyes, did not know how to continue the conversation, and Ursula, having lost confidence, again felt the lifelong status of a mistress. Eugene decided that it was time for him and his sister to move on, and said loudly enough so that Edward's girlfriend could hear that President Grand needed to choose his companions better. Edward kept turning around to look at his ex and her new man, thinking about how quickly she forgot him. Angelica went up to the roof of the hotel, where the pool was located, and enjoyed a cocktail while looking out at the evening city. Ursula approached her from behind and began to inquire why she had appeared at this party, concluding that it was obviously to get closer to Edward. Her rival again pricked her with the status of a mistress, and that the whole city knew about it. Then Ursula declared that Angelica was just an abandoned woman in a rented dress and jewelry. Here Angelica's patience came to an end. She calmly looked into the eyes of the boorish woman standing in front of her and declared that she had asked for it. A few seconds later, Ursula flew into the pool. At her screams, the guests came running. Edward and Eugene stood in front of everyone. Angelica remembered how everything happened again. 3 years ago, on the day of her wedding, Ursula insulted her by saying that Edward married her only to donate blood, and was also thrown into the pool by Angelica with screams. She thought, wow, it happened again. Meanwhile, Ursula screamed and shouted that they wanted to kill her and asked for help. And just like 3 years ago, having abandoned Angelica, he again rushed to save this scoundrel. The young woman remembered herself that day, how painful it was for her when, before her eyes, Edward worried about Ursula with such care and tenderness, pulling her out of the water. When Edward pulled Ursula out, she saw people and decided to play virtue, and lamented that Angelique was not to blame. She didn't do it on purpose. Angelica burst out laughing, and looking at the dumbfounded Edward, she said how much she could fall for this trick. After which she defiantly climbed onto the balcony and threw a wad of money at Edward, saying that she had returned the favor to her ex, and mockingly advising him to hurry up before others took it all. Edward told the sobbing Ursula to wait in the hallway, but he paid no attention to her protests. Edward decided to find his ex-wife and talk to her. He was told that she was with her companion in the ballroom. Entering the hall, he saw Eugene carefully feeling Angelica's ankle. Edward called out to her sharply. The girl was about to rise, holding the hand extended by her older brother. Eugene, seeing Edward's face, which showed irritation and anger, noticed that the man apparently had clearly not come to console his lady. Edward flinched when Eugene placed his hand on Angelique's shoulder. Edward, trying to restrain himself, said that she could tell him everything if she had any complaints, but not take it out on the innocent Ursula. Angelica grinned mockingly and contemptuously when she heard that she should apologize, saying that if not, he would probably push her into the water or hit her too. In response to his words about kindness and the fact that they were ex-spouses, the woman coldly said that she was cruel by nature. Gritting his teeth with anger, Edward jumped out of the hall. Eugene looked at his sister and tried to understand whether she still had any feelings for this man. Angelica understood this from her brother's eyes, and, grinning, assured him that she had overcome past mistakes. Edward was driving in the car and was silent. He wanted to think about everything, but at this time, Ursula plaintively begged him to believe her. She was not to blame for anything. Suddenly, the driver pointed his finger at the billboard on which the scene was scrolling by the pool on the roof of the hotel. The entire city could see and hear what actually provoked Angelique to send Ursula into the water. And the finale was the sound of a splash and Ursula falling into the pool. Edward clenched his fists and ordered the driver to stop, his companion screaming and begging him to let her explain. She screamed that his former abnormal person would not have put all this on public display otherwise. Edward turned to her and said that today was her last stay in this city. The man looked at the screen of the city billboard, where the scene by the pool was scrolling again, and wondered what was true in his marriage. Had Ursula been lying all this time? A car horn sounded, and his friend Louis, a rich playmaker who was married, slowed down next to him. A friend offered to let him down and commented on what was happening on the screen, concluding that it was right that he divorced this girl. Otherwise, she would have ruined his family. Edward barked at him to stop, but his friend was not offended at all. A second later, he even suggested going for a drink and relaxing, to which Edward agreed. A few days later at night, Angelica and her brother sat in one of the most elite restaurants in the city and discussed the lessons that a girl should take in the company in order to get up to speed. The brother offered to join the company, Julie, which has a project. The girl happily expressed a desire to try her hand. Eugene noted that he would soon be going abroad on business, but their third brother would return and be able to help her. Angelica beamed. She would see her brother. At that moment, behind her, she heard a loud female squeal about how she ended up here, calling the girl trash that needs to be thrown out of such a place. The manager tried to calm the guests down, but she pointed at Angelica and shouted that she had disgraced her in front of her friends and exposed her as a thief whom the police were looking for. The manager looked at Angelica and Eugene as he greeted the president. Grace's ex-mother-in-law supported the girl, shouting that she was thrown out of the Grand family, so what right does she have to be here? Here, Eugene intervened, saying that they had bad manners and an amazing ability to turn everything around. In general, an unscrupulous family. The women screamed even louder for the couple to be thrown out of the restaurant, to which the manager replied that the main shareholder of their restaurant was sitting in front of them. Angelica reassured the manager with a smile, assuring him that there was no point in ruining such a magnificent dinner because of these women. The girl, whose name was Laura, turned purple and said that they didn't care what position Angelica had achieved. She could deprive her of her job in the city with a snap of her fingers. When Angelica asked what she wanted about her, to which Laura, with a malicious smile, ordered to first apologize and pour wine. In the end, she was no stranger to it, saying that she served their family anyway. Our heroine sighed and calmly agreed, took a wine glass and poured red wine. Laura was bursting with pride and self-satisfaction. She was sitting at the table when red wine suddenly poured onto her head. Angelica bent down to the amazed girl and asked her to remember that she had filed for divorce, and if she heard at least one rude word from anyone again, then life would seem unkind to her. The ex-mother-in-law, running up to her screaming daughter, yelled obscene expressions at her ex-daughter-in-law and demanded a waiter. Approaching her brother, Angelica noticed that the air in the cafe was bad, and it was worth going to the VIP room. All the visitors looked at Grace and Laura, and a muffled hum was heard throughout the room. In anger, Laura Grand hissed after the departing Angelica that she would never forgive her for this. As soon as Edward drove up to the restaurant after them, Laura, a capricious little girl, wailing, rushed to her brother, telling her how this scoundrel had humiliated her in front of everyone. At this time, Angelica and her brother walked arm in arm to their car. Laura made an angry grimace and said that she got her into trouble. Edward walked up to his ex-wife and took her hand. Edward thought that she couldn't just pour wine on his sister and asked for an explanation. Angelica replied that she really poured red wine on his boorish sister. Laura rejoiced and asked Edward to make this scum kneel in front of her and apologize. The ex-wife smiled and looked slyly at Edward and asked if he really wanted her to kneel. Then she turned around and told President Grand that the recordings from the restaurant's cameras were available at any time, and added to Laura that she was behaving so pitifully, given her shady dealings, which her family had always covered up. The older brother added to Laura that if you attack, be prepared to answer for your actions. Laura whined like a little girl that she was accused of being the thief of that necklace, which she did not steal, but simply took. She is a family member, and she just said a few words, no more. Our heroine smiled contentedly and told them that she was not the obedient sheep she was before, and if this happens again, the punishment will be different. Eugene repeated about round-the-clock access to camera footage. Edward simply looked at the speeding car and did not recognize his former quiet, careful, and gentle wife. Laura began to talk about the fact that she was simply teaching a lesson to the bastard who had been fed and clothed by their family for 3 years, to which Edward barked at her to stop. Edward demanded an explanation from his sister about the necklace, to which she replied that, anyway, his wife had nowhere to wear expensive jewelry, and she was his sister. Edward decided to watch the video from the cameras, and Laura yelled that Angelica was probably hanging out with this guy while she was still married and was supporting him with Edward's money. Edward told her to shut up. Looking through the CCTV cameras, he saw the full picture and thought that his family had humiliated his wife throughout their marriage. Angelica's retaliatory strike, of course, shocked his mother and sister, but it was fair. In the end, he watched to the end in silent thoughtfulness. Then he turned to his sister and said that judging by this video, they constantly bullied Angelica. Now they need to apologize. Laura screamed that she would rather die than apologize to this rubbish. Edward sternly added that the man who was with his ex was a very important person in the city, and she wouldn't dare talk to him like that in the future. Laura grimaced with anger. Well, that's how it all turned out. She took the phone and dialed the number, saying that Angelica was humiliating her and she needed help. Angelica sat in her office listening to information from a trusted person that the Grand Company, through sources, hired a person to photograph her and put her in a bad light. The brother came up with coffee and asked if they needed help, to which the girl replied that she could take a photo if they wanted, and smiled. The young woman drank coffee and praised her brother that no baristas in the world could compare with his coffee. Then she added that she was starting to work at the company tomorrow and needed the help of the vice president for a few days to get up to speed. Martha suggested going to a bar and having a good time to celebrate this event. Angelica thought, why not? While the girls were dancing, someone threw a pill into the glass. When the girls returned to the table, Angelica said that she was going to the restroom, and Martha took a glass of cocktail and began to drink. The satisfied guy watched her with a grin. When Martha drank almost all of it, he approached her, hugged her cheekily, asking if the cutie wanted to have some fun. Angelica came out from the restroom and saw some guy pulling her friend off the table and trying to take her somewhere, and something was clearly wrong with the girl. She bravely stepped forward and in an orderly tone demanded that her friend be released. The impudent man, grinning, said that after she herself drank the contents of the glass. At that time, a red-haired girl approached Angelica and whispered that this was a famous bandit. Angelica replied that she should let her friend go so she can drink. The bandit pushed Martha, who could barely stand on her feet, away and thought about how much fun he would have today. Angelica asked the red-haired visitor to take care of her friend for now. Our heroine took the glass, turned away pretending to drink. At that time, the impudent man had already extended his hand to her. With a sharp movement, the girl hit the boor on the head with all her might with a bottle of wine. Then she professionally twisted him so that the guy begged to let go, screaming in pain. The visitors froze in admiration, admiring how the girl tied up with a strong man. Then Angelica took a glass of red wine and ordered the guy to drink it, or she would pour it down his throat. He tried to resist as best he could, muttering that he was wrong. In the end, Angelica forced him to drink a whole glass. Then she shook off her hands and said that it was unpleasant to meet scum like him. Then she approached the red-haired woman and thanked her for taking care of Martha. Following the departure of Angelica and Martha, the girls and boys whispered admiringly that she was not a knight, but a real queen. Alice smiled and believed that now this ungrateful fox, who had insulted Laura and humiliated his friend, would pay for everything. The next morning, Martha burst into Angelica's room as she was getting ready for work, shouting angrily that the girl was being banned from the internet again. Angelica, combing her hair, wondered why she was banned and what happened again. Marta began to say that a video had been edited online of Angelica beating a guy in a bar, and people began writing negative comments, and showed the video on the phone. Angelica was calm and told Martha just not to look, then she wouldn't have to be nervous. But the friend was determined to resolve the situation if they hated Angelica because of her. At this time, the butler approached and said that the driver and car were waiting for the miss, to which the heiress replied that she did not want to attract attention and would go to work like everyone else. The butler proudly added that the gentleman had ordered the cars, but they were still on the way. But she could take any working one from the latest models of Maserati, Porsche. Angelica thought with a grin that in her family such models are called workers. The butler asked Martha to take care of the young miss. At this time, the company was about to announce a new director, when Eugene entered the conference room with Angelica and introduced the girl as the new director of the company. One of the employees turned purple with anger. She had worked in the company for so many years, the position should have gone to her. She came forward and asked what Miss Angelica's talent was, other than the fact that she was the adopted daughter of a rich family for 3 years. The girl said that she would not work in such conditions, to which Eugene calmly noted that it was her right, and she could leave. The employee turned pale with anger. This is necessary. Mr. Eugene prefers this new girl to her, the one who has given years to this company. But then she apologized and asked for forgiveness for such an impulsive attack on her part. And having already pulled herself together, she added that she respected the company's decision and would work with Miss Angelica. Watching the new boss leave with evil eyes, she thought that she would remember everything. Because of her, she made herself look like an idiot today. At lunchtime, a happy Martha came into the office and said that she had whitened her friend's reputation by putting the phone in front of Angelica. A full video with all the details was circulating on the internet, where commentators admired Angelica, noting that with such a friend you don't even need a boyfriend. When Angelica asked where she found the full video, Marta just smiled contentedly and added that one call decided everything. Then the girls laughed, and Martha added that she would not allow anyone to criticize her friend. Angelica thought about it when she heard that Louis, her ex's friend, was behind everything, which means Edward was involved in this too. Angelica said that she would repay this boor, and Martha happily reported on the incriminating evidence she had stored up. She showed a photo of Louis in an embrace with 2 girls, clearly not of a business nature, just at the time when he just got married. Angelica published this photo and signed that she does not arrange secret surveillance and invites Louis to meet openly. The girls laughed, anticipating an interesting show. Louis flew screaming into Edward's office, poking him with a photo on his phone, shouting that his wife wanted a divorce and arranged this for him. Edward looked and calmly added that Louis was the first to humiliate Angelica on the internet, and she only answered him. Louis could barely contain himself from hysteria, exclaiming that he only wanted to teach a lesson and did not know that the video was cut off. When his friend said that he wanted to avenge Edward's sister, he only added that his sister did not learn from her mistakes. In response to his friend's lament that he was being kicked out of the house, Edward replied that it was all his fault, and he needed to apologize to the one he wanted to annoy. When his friend said why he should apologize to this hypocrite, Edward stood up and said that it was time for him to go to a meeting. Let him do as he knows. As a result, Louis sent an order to the communications department so that an apology would be made to Angelique on behalf of his account. Martha showed this to Angelica with pleasure, noting that the guy turned out to be flimsy and not 2 hours had passed. At this time, there was a knock and an employee entered the office, who was indignant in the morning and asked to talk to the new boss. Angelica said that she had no secrets from her friend. Then the woman apologized for the incident in the morning and asked permission to bring Miss Angelica up to date. She put the project in front of the girl, assuring that it would help her gain a foothold in the company. Angelica thought this was a suspicious step. Angelica said that she would think about it and asked, to which her friend noted that she could not calm down with the fact that she did not get the director's chair. Martha cheerfully promised to figure out what was happening here. Then she added that she and her friends had a chat where they secretly criticized Edward when Angelica was married. And today, everyone is going to celebrate the divorce, and she invites her friend to join. Edward and Louis arrived at the nightclub in the evening after seeing Angelica and Martha. Angelica and her friend also thought it was not a very successful and pleasant meeting. Martha sarcastically remarked that Louis shouldn't have come to such places after everything that was happening. And he, in turn, added that now Miss Angelica has a rich patron. Martha mockingly added that after relying on her husband for 3 years, her friend was now relying on her friend. The girls turned around and walked away, deciding not to waste any more time. Edward looked at his ex-wife, thinking about what she was doing here, and it was time to finally explain herself. Their friends were sitting with Martha and Angelica, who reported that in a few days there would be a grand show. Let Angelica take her 3rd brother and come. The guy was the head of a large corporation, and the pretty girl was the founder of a world-famous brand. Angelica thanked her friends and promised to come. Edward and Eugene approached their table and greeted the group. Namely, Eugene was interested in the heir Chuck Jr. and invited him to go and play with him. Chuck, calling Angelica his queen, asked if she minded, to which the girl shrugged it off and said that the Maniacs group would soon arrive and she would go downstairs to listen to them. The 3 girls stood up and decided to leave, since the company of Edward and Eugene was unpleasant to them. Edward kept his eyes on Angelique leaving. When the 3 of them were left at the table, Edward asked Chuck what kind of relationship he had with Angelica. He took a sip and simply replied that they were friends. Louis said that people like Angelica simply don't know how to be friends. Edward clenched his fists and ordered his friend to shut up. And Chuck Jr. looked at Eugene and asked if he knew what kind of person Angelique was. Louis sat there looking beaten, his best friend not supporting him at all. At this time, their conversation was interrupted by loud voices, and the musical group Banda Maniacs arrived. The girl fashion designer gave Angelica a violin and said that the violinist from the group was in the hospital after surgery to remove appendicitis. Without the violin, everything would not be the same. Let her play. At first, Angelica was taken aback to play the violin in the group so suddenly, but the confusion quickly passed and she agreed. The guys sat and discussed the release of the Banda Maniacs group. They said that the group was taking a break, and they were invited here for a tidy sum. The The guys froze when they saw a beautiful, slender girl masterfully playing the violin in the group. They opened their mouths when they realized it was Angelica. Edward watched what was happening in surprise, that the two never left. Angelica calmly sipped her drink. When Louis remarked that they didn't know that Angelique could play the violin, Martha quickly cut him off by saying that they were not obligated to report on all her friends' talents. When suddenly Louis suggested playing dice, Edward looked at his wife, noting how bright and independent she had become, but still caught her former, but already so distant features. As a result, unexpectedly for himself, he challenged her to play dice. Angelica smiled and replied, "Why not?" In the end, what would happen if she played with her ex-husband? The girl said, smiling. Marta got angry and tried to dissuade her friend because they wanted to provoke her. Louis sat with a smug smile. He knew that Edward was the best at dice and always won. Our heroine asked her ex-husband what he wanted to play. Before Edward could open his mouth, Louis shouted that if she wins, he will leave here naked, and if she loses, then Angelique will have to publicly admit that she married his friend for money and never appear in the city again. Angelica agreed with a smile. Edward gave in to spin the dice first. The girl took the glass and stirred. Then he also made a professional gesture with the glasses, under which there were bones, and Edward. Next, it was Angelica's turn again. She was absolutely calm, absolutely not nervous or worried. Edward didn't take his eyes off her, wondering if it really mattered whether she won or lost. Louis watched with joyful anticipation of victory. It was in their pocket. This girl was messing with the bones unprofessionally. It was immediately noticeable. It was Edward's turn to show the result, and he raised his glass. They rolled 3 to 6. It's obvious he won. Louis smiled and winked at his friend, saying that we were giving it away. Only Louis, smiling meaningfully, sat waiting. Edward's friend was already rejoicing. Martha lost her temper and said that her friend could not lose. At the result, it was impossible, and Louis thought he was going to have a seizure. The girl was left with 4x6 and 1 unit, an absolute winning combination. While everyone was sitting in a daze, she stood up beautifully and said that she would be getting ready to go home and let the others play. Edward acknowledged Angelica's victory with the soft smile of a loser, and Martha approached Louis, who was lamenting that this couldn't happen, and reminded him that everyone was waiting for him to come out naked. In desperation, he tried to accuse them of cheating, but Martha, with her eyes burning like a predator's, said that you need to be able to lose, and looked at Edward. Louis begged for help with a pleading look, but Edward calmly said that the promise must be kept. He realized that they would not let him get away with it. His friend was leaving, forcing him to pay with his promise. Martha and Chuck Jr. approached the poor fellow, rubbing their hands with pleasure. The guy looked so pitiful and tried to beg forgiveness for the bet. Angelica stood at the exit waiting for the car that her older brother had sent for her. Suddenly she heard her name, turned around and saw Edward. He was standing calm, but still a little nervous. The girl asked what Mr. President wanted from her. Edward apologized for his sister's behavior at the restaurant, telling her that he had watched the surveillance video and his sister had behaved inappropriately. The girl managed to tell him to control his family when she was interrupted by the cry of Louis jumping out naked. Angeli took it on her phone with a smile, saying that this was a photo for memory. Louis yelled why she was taking pictures of him, to which Angelica cheerfully remarked that it would be a sin not to capture such a scene. A car pulled up behind her. The girl casually told Louis that if he dared to contact her, these photos would be on the internet. Edward, looking at her, noted that it doesn't matter whether she plays the violin or whether she plays the dice. This is no longer the Angelica he knew. Quiet, sad, resigned, and kind. And he looked at his ex-wife for a long time until Chuck Jr. approached him. He asked Edward. He didn't expect such a turn. He didn't deny it and nodded, to which Chuck noted that 3 years is not enough to get to know a person well. He further added that he doesn't need to understand her. She is the best among them. When Edward asked what plans he had for Angelica, The guy admitted that he liked her, and since she was free, he wanted to become her boyfriend. Edward tried to hide his indignation, and Chuck thanked Edward for letting her go and opening the way. Louis shouted from the car not to waste time on empty chatter and went to the car. Marta and her friend looked at the guys and believed that they needed to be taught a lesson for Angelica. Otherwise, they would not calm down. When Chuck approached, Marta asked how Angelica knew how to play dice like that. Chuck, who was a classmate of the girl, said that when they were studying, Angelica had a fight with her family, and they stopped sending her money. And then she was deceived into working as a croupier in the largest underground casino. She gained experience and earned a lot of money. Her family got scared and gave her a black platinum credit card, only for her to leave the casino. After these words, Martha said what a pity that she didn't study with Angelica. Edward was driving in the car and thinking about Chuck's words. He wants to hit on Angelica. I wonder if she likes him too. Looking at his friend's serious and thoughtful face, Louis asked if he was angry, to which Edward replied that he needed to worry about his naked photos. Chuck's next words that his ex was such a bad choice. She never belonged in their circle. Edward sharply pressed the pedal. Barely hiding his anger, he ordered Louis to get out of the car, saying that he was going to the company. When Angelica came to the company in the morning, one of the subordinates reported that Ms. Leah was waiting in the office. Reporting the upcoming negotiations and schedule, they entered Angelica's office. The picture of Leah sitting in Angelica's chair, looking like a boss, made them freeze for a minute on the threshold. In order to somehow attract attention, the employee coughed, since the woman did not even hear them. The employee jumped up, and Angelica, in a cold tone, ordered that this chair be delivered to Leah's office since she liked this chair so much. She awkwardly tried to justify herself, but Angelica snapped back by saying that she was clean and would not sit in a chair after others. The same Leah, who was applying for the position of vice president, angrily thought that this bitch just slept with the president, and that's why she got the position. Then she handed her the documents with a creepy smile, noting that this would be a great deal. The director with whom the contract would be concluded invites them to dinner to sign the deal. Angelica found such obsequiousness very suspicious, but it was impossible to simply refuse. After the employee left, she gave the contract documents to the assistant and told her to raise the commission by 30%. Suddenly, Martha appeared in front of her with a huge bouquet of roses, asking for help. When asked what kind of bouquet this was, Marta winked slyly and noted that her friend clearly had an admirer. The girl took the bouquet in bewilderment, wondering who they might be from. Then she gave it to an assistant to take to another office, since she couldn't stand the too concentrated smell of flowers. After which Martha quietly said that she found out about the Fenton Company, with which they are offering a contract. It is a shell company that owes a lot of money, and this Leah is definitely trying to set a trap. Angelica thought that another enemy was trying to trample her, so the evening would not be boring. Marta shared the good news. Her mother bought a cosmetics company, offering to work there. This is her dream, so the poet will no longer be able to accompany her friend to work. In the evening, Leah took her boss to a business dinner, declaring that it would be private, so for their own good she did not take the secretary as a third. They entered the office. Leah loudly greeted the man sitting there. The director of the company, Fenton, was a small, bloated, repulsive-looking man. When he kissed Leah on the cheek, Angelica shuddered in disgust. Leah obsequiously introduced the vice president, offering to waste no time and sign the deal. They sat down at the negotiating table. Leah said since Miss Angelica was new to the company, she didn't know that she and the director were old friends. She was noticeably in a hurry to sign the document quickly. When the man opened the document, he became nervous and sweated. She and Leah unanimously exclaimed, "Who changed the terms of the contract with a percentage increase?" Angelica, calmly and confidently looking at them, added that she was the vice president of the company. Chuckling nervously, Leah stated that she had prepared everything and calculated why she was not notified. To which Angelica replied that she is the vice president and has the right to change everything at her own discretion. The employee was a bundle of nerves and said in a trembling voice that this is a business. Honesty must be observed. Angelica noted with a smile that apparently the personal interests of Mr. Director and Mrs. Leah were involved here. The director, smiling slyly, handed over his version of the contract, saying that this is 10% less than Madame Leah's. If Madame Vice President signs, then this 10% will be hers. Leah noted that Angelica should find as many sponsors as possible. She told the girl that her clothes from the internet and the way she gets to work by bus show that the president is not going to marry her and does not value her at all. So what is the use of serving someone who gives me pitiful crumbs? The woman stood up and said to think about her words. The director would give her an Audi, even if it was a used one. But if they worked together, he would get much more. As she left, the woman grinned evilly at how she had pulled off the whole thing by putting the drug in Angelica's glass. In the corridor, she called a worker whom she had bribed and asked if he had done what she ordered, and he nodded in the affirmative. The guy then asked in a trembling voice if this girl was not President Grant's ex-wife. At this time, Edward was listening to them behind the wall and was simply amazed when Leah chuckled and said that she had been thrown out of that family, and now she had nothing to do with them. She ordered the guy to mind his own business and remain silent. Edward was overcome with anger and indignation at what he heard. His only desire at that moment was to prevent misfortune. He waited until Leah left in order to catch the employee to find out the room in which Angelique was located. He ran into a guy who was horrified to see the president barking in which room his wife was in. Leah's accomplice pushed the keys to the Audi towards Angelica, expected a wonderful night with this beauty. Angelica, smiling sweetly, praised the wine, and her companion noted that as soon as everything was done, he would give her a new Audi. He was noticeably uneasy. His speech was slurred. He hiccuped and swayed. Suddenly, Edward burst into the room, kicking down the door. Before our heroine had time to be surprised, her ex-husband kicked the director, who fell to the floor. Angelica stood with her eyes widened in surprise, unable to open her mouth. Edward yelled at her that there was a drug in the wine, asking if she drank it. The girl wondered whether he was watching her, waiting for the moment to save her, or whether he accidentally ended up in this building. The director, swaying, rose to his feet and wanted to justify himself for what happened. How he got punched in the face again, this time from Chuck, who flew into the room. While the guy was beating the director, Angelica asked him to stop. Chuck stopped smiling when the director's face was already swollen with swelling. He turned to her, handed her a bouquet of flowers, saying that he had come to work to pick her up, found out that she was here, and came here. Watching this picture, Edward felt an unpleasant feeling of jealousy. Angelica replied that she had already learned everything she wanted, but there was no point in beating this bastard anymore. Why would they need trouble? The beaten director came to his senses after seeing the two presidents and realized that he had to leave. Since they were here and the ex-husband was so worried about this Angelica, it means she was still under his protection. Chuck gave him seconds to get away. When he saw the car keys, he threw them after him so as not to become an eyesore. Here Edward intervened, sternly saying how one could behave so carelessly and drink wine from strangers, realizing how dangerous it was. Listening to him scold her, she thought that by doing this he just wanted to teach her a lesson and not save her out of the kindness of his heart. Suddenly, Edward blurted out, this is the life she was striving for by filing for divorce from him. Angelica felt terribly unpleasant to hear this. Old grievances awoke again. Then she drained her glass in one fell swoop, noting that he was not the person who had the right to discuss her life. And besides, she changed glasses. To his surprise, what was she talking about? The girl noticed that she was here for work. She asked him what the difference was between this director and his family. Edward couldn't comprehend her accusations, trying to understand how she could compare such things. Leaving with Chuck, she told him that in his house, she was in the position of a maid and nothing more. Edward stood there confused when it was she who was his family's maid. At that moment, the realization came to him that he didn't know a lot about her. Walking down the hall, he heard the director complaining to his accomplice that the girl was prepared and knew everything. Edward walked and thought that Angelica did not need him, and apparently she never needed him. Angelica was driving in the car, also thinking that Edward didn't know her at all. Chuck broke the silence by noting that he saved her. She was grateful to him, to which the girl replied that she could give her some money. Chuck joked that this was the first time a woman had thrown money at him, but he would prefer her as his girlfriend. Angelica said that she always considered him as a friend and he had no chance. Chuck was spraying that he would prove to her how suitable a person he was for her. Angelica waved her hand, thinking that his passion would last no more than a month. Chuck smiled, thinking that he would not let anyone near her and would achieve her reciprocity. The next morning, Leia, in Angelica's office, nervously continued to convince her of cooperation with the front company. The vice president looked at the employee, amazed at her persistence. Angelica silently took out her phone and turned on the recording of the conversation. When Leia advised him to switch sides and discuss the director's attitude towards her. Then she added that if she transfers this recording to the right place, to check Ms. Leah's projects, she will be put behind bars. The woman got scared and, kneeling down, began asking Angelica to forgive her rashness, admitting that the project she was trying to drag her into belonged to a shell company. Angelica pretended to forgive, thinking that she could pull out a bigger fish through this employee. But for now, she would keep an eye on her. Louis tried to persuade Edward to take him to a restaurant for couples that had opened not far from his establishment, worried that he would lose his customers. Suddenly, a friend sitting with a girl called out to them from the table, calling them to join them. He joked to Louis that he came to investigate, worried that he would steal his clients. They sat down at a friend's table when Chuck saw the couple, recognizing his friend's ex-wife in the girl. She sat with Chuck, chatting nicely and drinking wine. The young man placed in front of her a bouquet of her favorite Swiss royal lilies. Angelica was touched, noting that it was immediately clear that the restaurant was his. The service here was first class. Actually, Chuck bought them for her personally, but decided to remain silent when he asked if she received flowers from him at work. The girl nodded affirmatively, asking in honor of what he sent, to which Chuck said that he was caring for her. Angelica asked not to waste time and energy on her. Louis and Edward did not take their eyes off them, but their friend's phrase about how young Chuck could pay attention to such a woman made Edward angry. Chuck invited Angelica to dance on the dance floor, so it was a friendly dance. He gallantly extended his hand. Angelica thought that if she refused, she would attract attention, so she agreed. The music started playing, and they started dancing. They were the only couple on the dance floor. Edward watched his ex-wife dance with President Chuck Jr., and suddenly his eyes and Chuck's eyes met. Chuck smiled at him without words, showing that the one you so easily refused was now his. To annoy Edward even more, he put his hand on the girl's waist and lowered it lower. Edward at that moment was experiencing a storm of emotions that were tearing him apart from the inside. Why did Chuck lean over pretending to kiss his partner, since she had her back to Edward? It looked exactly like that. When the music died down and they stopped, couples gathered around the dance floor applauding them. Chuck hugged Angelica, and they left. Although the girl moved perfectly to the music, Louis refused to admit it to himself. He believed that she was nothing more than a hunter of rich men. Their friend at the table called her an intriguer, who quickly found herself rich, at which Edward began to seethe. The friend continued, "She is an old, faded woman. Finally, all her friends were waiting for this. They never liked her, and he remembered how Angelica called him when, after the wedding, she and Edward were drinking, and she called to check. But the words about how he put his ex in her place that night, telling her not to meddle in men's affairs and to know her place, made Edward jump, slam his fist on the table, and order them to close. Edward angrily said that he is the head of the grand family, and no one dares to discuss members of his family. even former ones. The guys who tried to support their friend through male solidarity were shocked by this reaction. This was not the first time Louis had seen such a reaction when people spoke negatively about his ex-wife. He caught up with his friend and asked him to take their friend's words to heart. They were all like brothers. Edward thought about how everyone around him hated Angelica. Apparently because of this, she treats him this way. Edward remarked on not being angry at them, thinking that he was angry at himself. He told Louis that he could close his restaurant, he couldn't handle it, and went to the car. In the evening, Angelica and her brother were at a business party to sign an important contract. Some guests were discussing them. The girls did not take their eyes off Eugene. He had long been an eligible bachelor, but his companion attracted even more attention. The girls recognized her as the ex-wife of President Edward. How could he lose such a beauty? Eugene kept receiving compliments about his beautiful companion. Eugene whispered to his sister that the president of the company, Julie, with whom they wanted to get a contract, needed to go up. They were watched by a startled Laura and her friend. When the girl noticed that her ex-sister-in-law was beautiful, Laura turned black with envy when she saw her wearing a Louis Vuitton dress, which she could not buy, since it was only one copy and had already been reserved at that time. Therefore, she irritably answered her friend that she was simply looking for another sponsor who would support her for the rest of her life. Eugene and Angelica went up to the upper hall, where the president of Julie's company was 26-year-old Elvis Norton, an aristocratic-looking young man. They greeted him. Eugene introduced Angelica as the vice president of the company. The guy, with the air of a taster, appreciated the girl and complimented her exquisite beauty. Elvis, while talking to the girl, noticed if she was offended that he first canceled with them and now invited them to the party. Angelica assured that she was very glad to be here. The young president asked Eugene for permission to speak with his vice president alone. The girl promised her brother to give her all and get a cooperation agreement. Elvis stood with the narcissistic air of a conqueror of peaks, casually and playfully holding a glass in his hand, and asked why Angelica wanted to collaborate with his company. The girl replied that her conditions were transparent, and among all the investors, she did not see a better company than his. The young man carefully examined Angelica, noting that her words were far-sighted and courageous. He then asked how she viewed trilateral collaborations with other companies. The girl tensed up and asked which companies. Edward stood next to them. So, the Grand Company is a shareholder of Julie's company, which develops advanced artificial intelligence technologies. The president of the company, Julie, interrupting her thoughts, noted that he would not represent Mr. Grand. They already knew each other. Angelica asked Mr. Elvis why he needed a third party if he was already collaborating with such a large investor as Grand. Edward answered instead, saying that artificial intelligence is a new field and his company cannot take all the risks on itself. Elvis and Edward raised their glasses, waiting for Angelica's answer. Her ex-husband said that she would not be mistaken if she chose this project. Angelica appreciated his advice. He was right. This is a huge profit. You cannot allow others to make money from this because of personal hostility and grievances. And they clinked glasses as a sign of cooperation. President Julie invited Edward and Angelique to dance their first dance as an opening celebration of Julie's anniversary and their collaboration together. Angelica abruptly walked away irritably, saying that she couldn't dance, and Elvis noted that cooperation would not be easy. Edward was not offended. Everything he heard from his friends in the restaurant was that she had gone through enormous difficulties with him. Going down to her brother, who was waiting for the result of the negotiations, Angelica told what cooperation the president had proposed to Julie. The brother reassured her, assuring her that the risks were distributed and the benefits outweighed the possible damage. They benefited from such cooperation. Angelica warmly thanked her brother for his support. They were watched by Edward and Elvis, who, like everyone else, was surprised by Mr. Eugene, who was not interested in women, and then they appear with Miss Angelica. He continued to wonder out loud whether they were hiding their relationship. Then, Looking at Edward's tense face, he quietly said that everything was fine. He was there and would support him. At this time, the presenter announced the beginning of the anniversary celebration of the company and Julie. Edward and Angelica's faces changed when they were invited from the stage to open the dance. Edward approached her and bowed and asked permission to invite her to dance. Angelica had no choice but to give him her hand and go to the dance floor. Everyone present was looking at them. Edward led her by the hand, thinking that they didn't really have a wedding. He realized that this was the first time they were holding hands. They walked onto the dance floor while the guests looked at them with admiration, admiring the beautiful couple. The dance began, hugging his ex-wife. Edward felt the aroma of her perfume, and a tender feeling spread throughout his body. Angelica had the same thoughts, that now they were closer than ever in marriage. They danced to the rhythm of the music in unison, thinking about each other and discovering each other. Edward whispered to her with an underdress. Why did she lie? That she couldn't dance? To which the girl told him that it depends on the person you're dancing with. They had a quiet dialogue while dancing. Edward was surprised at her ability to conduct business. The girl countered by answering that he still didn't know much about her. The dance was coming to an end. The music began to fade. Edward, bending her over in the final movement, did not notice how he leaned towards her. Their eyes met. He almost kissed her. The spectators looked on in emotion. A roar rang through the hall that they almost kissed as they looked at each other. Angeli went to her brother, and he looked and thought how close she was to him now. Elvis, smiling, took his arm. Edward told him that he understood everything. It was his idea. Angelique met Chuck, noticing that he was late for opening. He began to flirt, saying that he was only here for her, to which Angelica replied that he was here because his father forced him. While they were discussing the events, someone called the girl's name in a hysterical voice. Furious, Laura shouted at her that she had neither shame nor conscience. Flirting with her brother like that, she would never end up in their family again. Angelica rolled her eyes, thinking what kind of kindergarten, when Chuck asked who this rude person is, who has no manners. Laura ordered her lover not to interfere at all. The guy beamed. Wow. He was introduced to the status of a lover. Our heroine asked Laura what she needed. She squealed for Angelica to stop pursuing her brother. Then she triumphantly declared, "His heart is occupied by Ursula." Just like that. And she is just a means for a blood transfusion, so don't even dream of returning to the family. Angelica loudly said that the whole world knows about the affair between her brother and Ursula, so it is no longer news that he is a scoundrel who cheated on his wife. The women who surrounded them wailed what a shame, how disgusting it was to cheat on your wife and not even hide it. Ursula, realizing that she had revealed the unpleasant side of her, pointed her finger at Angelica and said that she was selling herself to men. After which she stated that her brother's ex-wife continues to clinch money from him. She is nobody and nothing. An ordinary maid who does not have a penny to her name. Edward heard his sister's words with rage in his eyes and wanted to kill her on the spot. Lara, realizing that she had revealed everything that Edward did not know, confusedly tried to justify herself that she was simply teaching the impudent woman a lesson. Chuck contemptuously replied that even if he continued to spill out the disgusting details of his family, Angelica was truly unlucky to be a part of all this. When Laura began accusing him of having affairs with Angelique, Edward barked and ordered her to shut up. He loudly asked if it was all true what she had just said about what role Angelica occupied in his family. Angelica publicly answered that everything said was the pure truth. People groaned when they heard this. The divorce turned out to be even more scandalous than they wrote about it. Poor Angelica. Edward was shocked to realize that it was not only his friends who were bullying his wife, but his family as well. Angelica asked him, well, he now knows the truth, and what? Make his sister and mother kneel in front of her and apologize. Edward looked at the girl in confusion when she added that he could do it for them. Laura twisted with anger, and she asked who Angelica was so that she and her brother would apologize. Edward silenced her. Laura was hysterical while he was on the side of this boorish woman, and Edward understood that besides money, he could not offer anything as an apology. But she clearly doesn't need them. He tried to say something, but didn't know how to formulate it. Angelica told him to stop making a guilty face in public if he doesn't have the courage to apologize. Although these apologies cost nothing, then it's time to stop this farce. Then, glancing at Laura, she added that his sister had already disgraced her family enough by publicly admitting how the Grand family abused their son's wife by holding her as a servant. Laura stated that she was trying to seduce her brother. Angelica laughed and said, did she really think that she needed Edward? Then Angelica publicly said in front of everyone that 3 years ago, when she married Mr. Grand, she was blind and would not make such a mistake again. And she added words that made Edward sway, that if she had to seduce every man in this world, she would never return to Mr. Edward. Then she turned around and walked away, followed by Chuck with a grin, looking at Edward and how Angelica did him. Elvis turned to the guests to diffuse the situation, to have fun and dance. Admiring men came up to express their respect for such courage from Miss Angelica. Our heroine was flattered and thanked them for their support. Angelica drank with those who wanted to support her and express admiration. Chuck approached her and asked if the lady needed help. The girl smiled shyly and replied that she had actually had a little too much to drink. Chuck asked her why Laura said she tried to seduce Edward today. Another of the admiring young men approached them with an offer to drink to Miss Angelica. Chuck grabbed the glass from him, saying that the lady had already drunk a lot today, so he would drink this glass for her. Angelica went to the restroom, standing at the sink. She washed her hands. The water made her feel better. She heard 2 people going to the restroom, talking loudly and calling Angelica a bitch. It was not difficult to understand that it was Laura and her friend. The girl wiped her hands with a paper towel, looking at them in the mirror. They did not immediately notice her. Miss Grand attacked Angelique with irritation and that she was still a poor woman and had to pacify her anger and endure. Then, hitting the patient, Laura called Angelica a walking jar of blood who married her brother in order to get money from it. After these words, a veil seemed to fall over Angelica. Laura did not heed the warning to close her mouth, but she continued to insult the girl as a beggar and a corrupt woman. Angelica suddenly threw a glass of cold water in her face. Laura screamed. She held the wet dress in anger, declaring how dare she stain her Dior. She raised her hand to hit Angelica. When she intercepted the blow with a sharp movement, she twisted her hand painfully and said that she was no longer the one who suffered humiliation. Now she will clean her dirty mouth and teach her a lesson in good manners. Taking Laura by the hair, she plunged her head into a sink of water. Her friend, pale with horror, did not even try to intervene. Holding his head under water, he pulled it out of the sink with the same sharp movement. Laura whined, and her friend tried to help her somehow. Angelica looked with satisfaction at the lesson presented. Then, turning beautifully, she added that if Miss Laura did not calm down, the lesson would be even tougher. Laura really looked at her in fear, not believing her eyes. Could it really be that Angelica who lived in their house? In the corridor, she met Edward, who tried to talk to the girl. He asked why she divorced without a reason, but it was probably too late to ask for an answer. He tried to explain about Ursula, whom he sent out of the city, but the girl interrupted him with irritation, noting that she did not want to listen to all this abomination again. She told him that from now on they were strangers. Eugene was waiting for her in the hall, offering to go home, since the girl was clearly tired. Having hugged his sister, he led her to the exit. Chuck followed them, but Eugene stopped the guy's attempts. The wealthy couple is suspected of renewing their romance, and a photo of Edward and Angelica during a dance was circulating online and in comments this morning. This post was sent to her by friends in a chat. Angelica, frowning, deleted it. Then she learned from Martha that Chuck had spent millions to remove a hot headline from the internet. He asked her to accompany his artist friend to the auction, since he himself could not because of business. She was sitting at a charity auction with an artist, a nice guy who offered to order her a snack. Angelica thanked her, refusing to eat as she was not hungry. Looking around the hall, she saw Laura and Grace, who were sitting with their backs to them and could not see. At this moment, the presenter announced the next exhibit from Madame and Miss Grand, an emerald pipe with a starting price of $3 million. Angelica gasped. This is a family heirloom inherited from her ancestors. This is the treasure of old Mr. Grand and is very dear to him. She remembered how she once accidentally touched her when she was cleaning the hall and spent the whole night on her knees in front of her mother-in-law, who scolded her all night. Angelica thought that many would not even dream of just looking at this pipe, but Grace actually put it up for auction. Angelica smiled and decided to play with them. When they announced a price of $3 million, she bet on $10 million. Laura and Grace jumped as if scalded when they saw Angelique smiling. Grace understood that no one would dare to bid for this pipe. She just wanted to do everything necessary to participate, put the pipe up, and then buy it back. She screamed furiously that she was giving $11 million. Angelica raised the bid to $12 million. Mother and daughter looked in fury and horror and did not understand what she wanted. Grace, like a bundle of nerves, raised the bet to $13 million, hoping that the scoundrel would run out of limits. Angelica calmly offered $15 million. Laura quickly shouted that she gave $20 million. Angelica didn't want to intimidate them. She just wanted to get what she wanted by calling the bid $30 million. Grace and Laura angrily thought that she was the one who deliberately spoke out against them. They didn't have more than $10 million on their deposit. Angelica was announced as the owner of the pipe. She stood up and waved. They brought the treasured pipe to Angelica, packaged, and asked her to check the integrity and sign for it. The girl, who knew this thing well, looked inside and, seeing a small red spot, was convinced of its authenticity. As she was about to leave, Grace made claims of ignoring and disrespecting her elders. She turned to them, while the former mother-in-law reproached that if a rich sponsor appeared, this was not a reason to disrespect older family members. Angelica chuckled and noted that Mrs. Grace was experiencing memory deterioration with age, since she no longer had anything to do with their family, and she was not her mother-in-law. Laura demanded that she treat her elders with respect. Angelica, looking into her eyes, coldly noticed that she apparently intended to teach her a lesson. Grace understood that old Mr. Grand would not forgive her for this. She offered Angelique $30 million for the pipe, to which Angelica cheerfully said that if they had $30 million, they would have bought her out themselves. Then she loudly added that she bought the phone legally for real money, and everyone can confirm this. Angelica said that she was happy. If she was happy, she could afford such things. Having paid with an unlimited black platinum card, she signed. At that moment, Edward entered the hall. When he approached, the deal had already been completed. His mother and sister ran up to him, babbling that his ex had bought his grandfather's favorite pipe. He yelled at them, "How dare they take the old gentleman's thing and bring it to auction?" Angelica turned around and walked towards the exit, declaring that she would not interfere with the family reunion. Former relatives started babbling that she could not carry this thing with her. Then Angelica waved them documents confirming that she was now the rightful owner. And she added, looking at her former mother-in-law, that she should look for a place to live, since old Mr. Grand might now throw her out of the house. The mother-in-law said why she bullied her, to which Angelica replied that the Grand family's favorite thing to do was bully her. Edward asked how much she wanted for the pipe. Angelica smiled and replied that it looked like she didn't have enough money, saying that this was just the beginning. A secretary came to Angelica in the morning with a bouquet of red roses, saying that Mr. Grand was inviting her to a business dinner. She ordered to throw away the bouquet and from now on not to ask her if requests for dinner come from the Grands, to immediately refuse. The secretary noticed that the bouquet was from Mr. Chuck. The girl still ordered to throw it away. When Chuck ran in and offendedly asked not to break her heart, He specially bred this type of roses for her. Angelica asked him what he was doing in the office, to which the guy replied that he wanted to invite her to dinner. He pouted offendedly, saying that she was now in his debt. The girl agreed, and in the evening after work, they went to a restaurant and ran into Edward and Louis. Louis sarcastically remarked that because of the new gentleman, she had no time to accept invitations to have dinner with Edward. Angelica retorted that he was very interested in her personal life. Would Mr. Lewis want to invite her on a date? In response to his outburst that he did not look at women like her, she said that she was demanding of male physique standards, and his body did not meet them. The girl publicly recalled how he ran out naked after betting on a bet. Lewis flushed and thought that he would have killed her if it weren't for the incriminating evidence in her hands. Chuck suggested that Angelica go out to dinner before they spoil their appetite. When they ate, Angelica realized that she was a little tipsy and said that she was going to the restroom to wash her hands. Walking down the corridor, she swayed a little. Edward walked around the corner. When they ran into each other, Edward wanted to talk to her, but Angelica annoyedly said that she was already leaving. To his persuasion, she replied that for all work issues, he could contact her assistant. Edward again started bidding on the pipe, asking her to name any price, to which the girl replied that this topic was closed and she was ignoring him. Meanwhile, Chuck was looking for her, saying that a car had pulled up. The girl said that she forgot her bag. Then Chuck offered to go get her and let her wait in the car. While waiting for Chuck in the parking lot, she saw Edward and Louis walking. They did not see her, having heard that the men were talking about Ursula returning from abroad. Louis noticed that he missed her. She had been gone for a long time. Even though she did wrong, she was one of them, and the punishment was too cruel. Angelica clenched her fists. They call being sent abroad punishment. She will show her what real punishment is. When they arrived at Angelica's mansion, it was already late. Chuck saw that the girl was upset about something. Then he took her hand and told her not to worry about that scoundrel Edward. He doesn't deserve it, and she is his queen. Chuck spoke with tenderness in his voice, without a hint of obscenity, with genuine concern. Angelica was a little embarrassed and surprised, but she wasn't ready for a relationship yet. Our heroine joked that crowds of girls were running after him, but apparently they weren't enough for him. Louis replied that he only needed one, and looking at the girl, said goodbye and went home. Left alone in the living room, she noticed the pipe she had bought and decided to take a photo of it. A couple of minutes later, she posted a post on the internet with a call to evaluate and like her new acquisition. The next morning, entering her office, she saw her former father-in-law and Laura. He remarked to her that she never learned good manners when entering the office. Angelica walked to her chair and sat down in it, noticing that she did not have the habit of knocking when entering her office. The elderly chairman, having recovered from what he had heard, said that he had underestimated her abilities. It is clear why she initiated the divorce and found a new, wealthy family. Angelica answered him condescendingly, demonstrating that his power no longer affected her, that she no longer intended to listen to him on her knees as before. Laura attacked her as she was talking to her grandfather. Where were her manners? Angela sat proudly in a chair and said that in her office there are no juniors and seniors. There are only bosses and subordinates. Then Miss Grand began to reproach her that grandfather was old, and with her behavior she could give him a heart attack. To which Angelica calmly replied that this was not her grandfather. Then the elderly gentleman demanded that Angelica name her price and sell the pipe, to which the girl, laughing, declared the futility of their intentions. Even if they kneeled down, they would not receive it. Laura screamed that she hated their family and was doing all this on purpose. Angelica answered her coldly, looking into her eyes, that everything was true. She was far from the kindest and weakest person in the world. Then Mr. Grand said that he would call the chairman and tell him that his son was dating a divorced woman. Angelica replied that they should try. She would enjoy this picture. When Mr. Grand was dialing, Laura was jubilant. Now they will show this upstart. He dialed the president and said that he wanted to talk to him. The man said that he was actually fishing right now. Angelica could barely contain her laughter. They wanted to complain about her to her own father. The elderly Grand started talking about whether he knew that his son Eugene had become intimate with a divorced woman, to which Angelica's father innocently replied that he had no idea. But his son is a young man. It is not surprising that he was attracted to a woman. Laura's grandfather said irritably that she was a divorced woman, and his son promoted her to vice president of the company. Doesn't this fact bother him? Angelica's father advised the chairman to worry about his family and the pipe that his ex-daughter-in-law had recently bought. And having said that he had a big catch on the hook and hung up, Edward's father stood in amazement. He then said that Angelica was lucky this time. But did she really think about becoming part of this family? To which the girl confidently replied that she did not think, but knew that she would become part of this family. Then she called the guards, ordering them to take these people away and no longer allow strangers into her office. When leaving, Old Man Grand promised her that since she did not agree in a good way, she would do it in a bad way. When they left, the girl called her father, asking how many fish he caught, and they laughed together at the recent dialogue. Angelica laughingly told how they came to her office and complained about her right in front of her. At this time, the secretary came and said that President Elvis from Julie was inviting him to a business dinner. The girl said that she would come for dinner. Arriving for dinner, she met a smiling President Julie and her ex-husband. Angelica got angry, thinking that he decided to become a mediator and set her up with her ex every time. Sitting down at the table, the girl noted that Mr. Elvis had lured her into a trap. Then she added, looking at Edward, that if we talk about the pipe again, he might forget. Edward told her not to take his grandfather's words seriously. Angelica thought, if he needs this tube so much, why not? She asked President Julie to leave her and Edward alone. The girl looked at her former husband and stated her conditions. Within a year, Ursula must return to her as much of her blood as she had donated to her for all 3 years. Edward was taken aback and unable to say anything. Angelica continued that Ursula did not deserve her blood. She returned the money to Edward and should get her blood back. Edward asked if Angelica would return the phone to him if Ursula fulfilled the conditions, to which Angelica said that time would tell. Edward met Ursula at the airport. She hung on Edward, trying to figure out if he missed her. In the car, he stunned her with the news that she would have to return Angelica's blood within a year. Ursula whined and said in a wailing voice that she had been punished enough. She might as well just apologize to her. Then, pressing on Edward's pity, she remembered his late army friend. Would he allow him to mock her like that? Edward thought he'd talk to Angelique to see if she could agree to a 3-year term. At this moment, Ursula harbored thoughts about Angelica's death. Edward came to work with Angelica, to which she noticed that it seemed like he had nothing to do. Edward asked her to extend the deadline for returning the blood by 3 years, since it would be extremely difficult for Ursula to do it in a year. Angelica was hurt by what she heard, which means he feels sorry for Ursula and how hard it will be for her. The girl picked up the phone and said that she agreed. Before Edward could rejoice, she dropped it on the floor. Another moment and the pipe, broken into pieces, lay on the office floor. Angelica said that he could take his thing. Edward was escorted out by security. He was indignant, but could not utter a word. After he was taken out of the office, Angelica's assistant came up and reported that unpleasant rumors were being spread about her. He reported that they were talking about her, that Mr. Eugene was keeping her as his mistress, and at the same time she was sleeping with Mr. Chuck. There was also gossip that the Grand family threw her out, and these rumors were started by Leia, who was going to the salon for a party today. Angelica, in a luxurious outfit, was waiting for her employee, deciding to teach a lesson and enjoy the show. The girl looked for her and noticed a table where Leia was discussing her with other girls. She heard her name and the fact that she was spoken of as a poor mistress. One of the girls was indignant at such a fall. It was time to look in the mirror and realize what she was doing. Leah added, "Well, Who would marry a divorcee with an unknown past? Who was only capable of jumping in men's beds? Angelica stood behind with a wineglass, declaring how much new she had just heard about herself. And she's popular, since she doesn't leave the lips. Leia broke out in a cold sweat, babbling that it was so unexpected to see her here. Her companions froze. Angelica, pouring wine on the gossiper's head, said, "These are not coincidences. She came here on purpose." Leia jumped up, screaming what Angelica was doing. She must be sick in the head. Her friends began to demand that the guards take Angelica out. What right did she have to come to where she was not invited? Angelica took Leah's hand, saying that she had prepared a special gift for her, and this was not a recording of that conversation. A minute later, a video appeared on the screen in which Leia was engaged in lovemaking with a man. The women groaned in disgust. Someone said that this was the director, whose wife was present today and recognized her husband in the video. It was a complete failure for Leia, who was contorted with helplessness, anger, and impotence. Before she had time to come to her senses, the offended wife ran up with her husband, whose Leia was showing off on the screen, and slapped her so hard that her mistress could barely stay on her feet. Angelica had nothing else to do here. The show was enchanting and ended on an even more pleasant note. Her and Marta's friend returned from abroad and invited the girls to her show. The next day, the friends arrived at the office of the store for VIP clients. A store was vacated for them to present exclusive collections that were produced in one copy. The general manager sat Angelica and Martha down so they could look at the models for their outfits. Martha admired the collection, noting that everyone would look great on Angelica, and in the end, she said that in that case she would buy all the dresses. At this time, a loud and irritated voice came from the lower floor. "Where is the service? There is no one who could serve the customer." The managers tried to reassure Laura, who read that no one met such a person as her, and she had to wait. And Ursula came with her. Martha, watching from the top floor, winced and told her friend that her worst assumptions had come true. Laura and Ursula had arrived. The manager told the angry guests that there were important customers upstairs, and they could not be distracted. If the girls wanted to get to the second floor, they had to wait until tomorrow. This didn't stop Laura. How could she, young Mrs. Grand, have to wait until tomorrow to see who could be more important than her? And in a decisive tone, going up to the second floor, she said that if the customer from above wants to be alone, let her come down, and she will go upstairs. Having risen to the top, Laura and Ursula froze when they saw Angelica and Martha, whom they hated. Martha couldn't help but sarcastically say that when she heard the noise downstairs, she just thought that someone with very bad manners had come. Fakely smiling, Laura noted, "Why don't they all look at the models together?" And Ursula, without taking her eyes off Angelica, noticed that they had not seen each other for a long time. Martha, without allowing Angelica to insert a word, answered Ursula. "So who is this?" But her mistress, the manager, nervous and seeing that the situation was heating up, made an attempt to send Laura and Ursula downstairs, noticing that they arrived later. At this time, Ursula figured that the modeling show was only available to important and even more important people, so this was a good opportunity. In an unctuous voice, she cooed that Angelica wouldn't mind if she and Laura joined. In a sharp tone, our heroine replied that she was against it, and she added with a smile because their breath spoils her mood. Ursula, clearly not expecting such a reaction, stood embarrassed, holding back her anger. Martha was gleeful at her reaction and suggested that both girls get out and not take up their time. The manager was still trying to persuade them to go downstairs, and there they would find models for them. But Laura was furious. This attitude was like a slap in the face. Shouting that she had money, Laura demanded that she pack all the things that Angelica wanted to buy. Then, pointing her finger at the girls, she demanded that they be thrown out. Then Angelica agreed to give her all the chosen items. But would Madame Grand want to return them back because they are too expensive? But Laura triumphantly declared that she would not return anything, even if she had to throw the item away. She was not a poor woman, unlike Angelica, who was sponsored by a man. Angelica grinned. That's how it means. She recorded on her phone everything Laura said regarding things. Then she handed over the recording to the manager as evidence if Miss Grand retracts her words and asks for the things to be returned. Then they can demand the money from the Grand family. Laura still proudly declared that she could afford anything. Angelica, smiling, told Martha that it was time for them to go. It was unlikely that they would be able to find anything suitable today. Before Laura and Ursula had time to rejoice at their victory, they were shown a bill for several million that they almost lost consciousness. The girls arrived at the invitation of their friend to a closed modeling show. The friend promised to transform them and make them the highlight of this show. A surprise was being prepared for Martha and Angelica that they did not suspect. The host began the show by announcing that the stars were about to appear on the podium. The theme of the show, Gifts of the Galaxy, where the emphasis is on the fact that each woman is a unique constellation in the galaxy, Martha was the first to present the designer collection. The founder of the show announced that women can be princesses, knights, kings, queens, or even ordinary dust. She herself came out in one of her outfits. The guests gasped in admiration. Laura and Ursula stood behind. Next, the audience was treated to a grand debut, the bright star of this show. The final outfit was called Cassiopeia, symbolizing confidence, tenderness, and brightness. Angelica walked onto the podium in a triumphal outfit, shining like a crown. The presenter accompanied her exit with words of mystical, majestic, elegant. It also symbolizes that every woman is a queen. Laura looked admiringly and praised the beautiful outfit and how beautiful the model is. Although she can't see her face, she will definitely take a photo with her. Angelica was majestic and effectively completed the debut of the collection. The young man did not take his piercing gaze off her. Laura dreamily shared her impressions. She was especially struck by the last model. Such a beauty. I wish she could marry her brother. But the embarrassed Ursula quietly noted that the modeling world is full of dirt. They get it all through booze and bed. Martha heard them as she passed by and did not fail to interject that if they spoke like that about the models, then it would have been better not to come to the modeling show at all. Laura and Ursula asked how she ended up here, but Martha did not miss the opportunity to ridicule their dresses, which Angelica refused, whether they really wear them. The girls felt humiliated. They wore what their competitor refused. Afterward, Laura stated that she came not to cross paths with her, but to take a photo with the model in the Cassiopeia dress. Martha immediately shouted to Angelica that her fans were waiting for her here, dreaming of a photo. It was the final blow when Angelica came up and said that not everyone could take a photo with her. Laura was shaking with anger. How could this happen? Why was Angelica here? Then she shouted that she would not take pictures with her. It would lower her level, not forgetting to add that she was the young mistress of the Grand family, and Angelica was the one who was thrown out by her brother. Their friend, the founder of the show, intervened, noting that she had not given the ticket to Mr. Grand himself. How they got here themselves. Not knowing what to answer, Laura and Ursula nervously shifted from foot to foot. Angelica, without deigning to look at them, told her friends that it was time for them not to waste time on emptiness. Laura capriciously screamed with jealousy and despair. Why Angelica? Why is she here? The designer looked back at the girls with contempt, measuring them with her gaze. Then she coldly quit because Angelica is in charge here. She is the star of this show. And she showed the girls the door. There was definitely nothing for them to do here. But Angelica's gaze was attracted by the young people who appeared at the entrance. She was tracked by reporters, one of whom got wind that she was the main shareholder. Angelica realized that she would have problems if she got caught by the press, so she needed to run away. Having picked up the hem of her dress, she commanded her friends that they need to hurry up. The reporters followed Angelica so as not to miss her. She ran past a stranger watching her during the show. Suddenly, she felt a strong hand on her arm. The young man opened the door and quickly opened it. Angelica, taken aback by surprise, looked at the stranger. He indicated that she should speak quietly. Reporters ran past the room where he took the girl, not understanding where she had disappeared. Angelica had a lot of questions, but the young man put his finger to her lips so that they would not be identified. The girl was embarrassed. Her heart was pounding. He stood so close that she could feel his breathing. They heard the voices of remorseful journalists who said that they needed to search everything again. The young man said that the reporters had finally left, and Angelica, without taking her admiring glance off him, thanked him for his help. The guy replied that he didn't do anything special. It was just fleeting help. Angelica extended her hand and introduced herself. But he did not introduce himself, and, opening the door, said to walk carefully, since the reporters were still in the building. He looked after the retreating Angelica with a smile on his lips. Marta, seeing her friend, ran up to her, asking where she had hidden, and our heroine told her about the mysterious stranger who helped her. The girls immediately began discussing the guy, his appearance, how he helped, what he said, but Angelica noted with regret that he never introduced himself. Their sweet, girlish cooing was interrupted by the voice of Edward approaching. They stared at him with a question on their faces, and Martha muttered why he was here too. Edward approached his ex-wife and asked how she became a shareholder of the company. He learned this from his sister, to which Angelica replied that she was not obliged to report to her ex-husband. At that moment, they were interrupted by the broken voice of Laura, who wailed that Ursula could barely stand on her feet. She had lost so much blood. Edward jumped up to the girls and asked what was happening, since Ursula showed with all her appearance that she felt very bad. Laura said that Ursula saw him and asked to say hello, but then fell and was bleeding heavily. Angelica turned to Martha and said that she needed to go and have a good rest. But the whole hall heard Laura's heart-rending scream, screaming that how good it was that her brother divorced such a woman. Marta took out her phone and offered to call the police so that some people would not return here again and would not blame them for their problems. Ursula, still trying to evoke pity, played along with Angelica, calling her her savior. Then she fell to Edward, languidly saying that she was dizzy. He urged Angelica to come to her senses, because Ursula was suffering. Everything is boiling with anger for Angelica. He is again trying to put pressure on pity in order to get what he wants. At this moment, a male voice was heard addressing Edward, shaming him for not being able to solve even this problem. Everyone turned around at the same time and froze, looking at the approaching stranger. This was the same young man who hid Angelica from reporters, and now he is again defending her in front of her ex-husband and his family. His appearance froze Laura and Ursula in place. The guy was a real handsome man. He turned to Angelica and asked her to tell him when she was going to meet with such scum. Our heroine babbled that she could take care of it herself. Ursula and Laura decided to denigrate Angelica in front of a stranger, stating that she slept with Edward for money until he threw her out. And in general, she is a corrupt and deceitful woman. But the young man just grinned and said to Ursula, "A minute ago she couldn't stand, but now she's talking so energetically." He bluntly stated that she was lying. Ursula blushed and did not know what to answer. The man added that one is faking her illness, and President Grand is condoning it. At this point, Laura screamed how dare he slander them, and heard her brother telling her to shut up. The young man looked at Angelique with love and asked permission to protect her in the future if the need arises. Angelica was floating. Of course, she played along with him and agreed to accept help. Then he resolutely took the girl by the hand and led her to the exit, declaring that there was nothing more to waste time on here. Martha was also fascinated by the noble intercessor and got goosebumps. Laura, Ursula, and Edward looked after them in silence. They had nothing more to say. In the parking lot, the stranger apologized for having to intervene urgently like this. He hopes that he did not offend Angelica. The girl sincerely thanked him for his help for the second time. Smiling and looking at him with curiosity, she asked him to give his name, and he introduced himself as Daniel. Angelica could not take her eyes off him. The name was familiar to her, and it seemed she had seen him somewhere before. Trying to remember where they could have crossed paths, she didn't immediately hear Daniel ask her, "Wouldn't it be difficult for her if he gave Miss Angelica a ride home today?" The girl happily agreed, but the young man thought that she didn't recognize him. The next morning, our heroine slept off after so many events, but her sleep was interrupted by the persistent ringing of her smartphone. On the other end, Martha was indignant at how Angelica could sleep when she was being vilified to the fullest extent on the internet. Someone published several posts where they throw mud at Angelica, and it can't be stopped. Angelica's post next to her older brother and signature, after the divorce, she did not receive a penny. Where did she get the Bentley from? And here she is with Chuck, and the signature is who sponsors Miss Angelica. Then there were photos with President Elvis. But the most unpleasant thing is that all this affected the price of shares in the company. She had to interrupt the conversation with Martha. Her brother called. He had already seen everything and told his sister not to go out or come to the office today. Angelica knew that it was old Mr. Grand who harbored a grudge over the pipe. Her brother said she didn't need to do anything. Her father was going to announce her identity at the company's anniversary celebration. Therefore, the more harshly they scold her now, the more ardently they will have to apologize to her later. At this time at the Grand Estate, the old gentleman was in a great mood. While drinking his morning coffee, he asked his assistant if there was any news about this woman. His mood darkened when he learned that at first, the price of their company's shares fell slightly. But thanks to the actions of the president, the shares became stable again. The old gentleman ordered to call Angelica. At this time, Angelica was sitting on the phone, choosing perfume. The product was demonstrated in a live broadcast. The girl advertised fragrances and offered to follow the link to order. Just as Angelica was about to go over and place an order, she heard an incoming call, and she didn't place an order. The link was closed. Then she decided to write in writing that if the presenter is in Europe, then she needs to pick up gifts. The cost will not be a problem. The manager read the message with surprise and wrote back that she did not take personal orders. Then Angelica offered to buy all her products, and she would simply broadcast for her. The girl grinned and imagined how she would put this impudent upstart in her place. If you buy all the goods, that means yes. Angelica received a message from her. Today they have sales of 800 million. Can she afford this? And there was a live broadcast where the presenter told the audience that she was bothered by a customer who could not afford the goods of her store. And if so, she advised them to think about whether they work hard to afford premium goods. Comments began on the broadcast. Someone said that the presenter treats customers terribly. On the other hand, money is not easy to earn. There were those who wrote that the rich baby is not rich enough. At this time, the presenter's phone rang, and seeing that it was the boss, she was surprised that at such a time. A couple of seconds later, coffee flew out of her like a fountain when the boss yelled that a buyer who couldn't afford their goods had just bought out their company and was now running them all. And if she doesn't serve her properly, she'll pay for breaking the contract and leave the company. Angelica was looking forward to the continuation. Returning to the live broadcast, the presenter put on a smile and said that Madam had returned and she would broadcast for her. But angry comments began to pour into the chat that she looked down on the hard workers. Angelica wrote that she would take everything she had. There was no need for broadcasting, and also, she was fired. Well, this is a good way to end the evening. The girl sat back on the bed, satisfied with herself. But the pleasant euphoria was interrupted by an incoming call. This Mr. Grand is calling again. She asked him if he had time to make calls to her personally, but the old man irritably scolded her for dropping his calls. He was even more amazed and infuriated at the same time when his grandson's ex replied that she could allow any calls to be dropped. He suggested that she not argue, but apologize for the broken phone, pay 300 million in compensation, and he would make sure that she would stop being attacked on social networks. He will also give her a job in his company, and she will be able to earn a living. With a laugh in her voice, she answered the old gentleman that she saw nothing wrong with breaking what she bought, and he could throw food to his dogs. He went to threaten, but the girl threw him off. She was pretty tired of him. Old Mr. Grand, seething with anger, ordered to find out where she was, to pay the journalist to conduct a good interview for her, and she shouldn't care. The girl stood at the door of her older brother's house with gifts. When they opened the door, she pulled the bags forward, shouted a surprise, and showed that she had bought him gifts. But the same handsome stranger who saved her twice looked at her in shock. Still with the packages in front of her, Angelica stood with her eyes round in surprise and was only able to squeeze out what he was doing here. Daniel said that he came to Eugene and offered to help bring in all her things. The older marriage came out and asked Angelica if she didn't remember Daniel. They met in childhood. The girl stared at Daniel in surprise, trying to remember. The guy smilingly replied that it's okay that she doesn't remember him. The main thing is that he remembers her. The brother said that when they were children, their grandfather even joked about their engagement. Angelica thought for a moment. The word engagement echoed from the distant past. After a couple of seconds, she blushed and screamed, "It's you!" She remembered the funny little boy whose grandfather came to visit them, and her grandfather said that when he grew up, he would marry Daniel. But she meekly said that she did not want to. How he has changed so much. As a child, he looked like a girl, as he had a funny hairstyle with 2 ponytails. The girl already answered with a smile that it turns out they know each other well. How things went with him all these years. Eugene answered for his friend that he was not married and was very upset when he learned about Angelica's marriage. Daniel agreed and said that he should have come and seen her then. For a reason, leaving her brother, she said goodbye to Eugene and Daniel and was getting ready to go home. How she stopped with dissatisfaction and coldly left when she saw her ex-husband. He said that he came to see her and wanted to talk. Something was constantly bothering them. The ex again insisted on her apologizing to her grandfather, and he would deal with what was happening on the internet. But Angelica said that she was not an idiot, and there was no need to either care for her or reproach her for her actions. The girl was infuriated by his duplicity. She recalled how his family poured the dirtiest bucket of slop on her. However, Edward only admitted that he had been wrong in the past. But she abruptly cut him off, turned around and said that it was not the first time that she had been thrown mud at her, but let his grandfather stop interfering in other people's affairs, or then not be offended by rudeness. Edward was overwhelmed with emotion. She was angry. She didn't even let him finish. At that moment, the door opened and Daniel appeared on the threshold, who heard the noise and sharp voice of Angelica. He looked at Angelica and Edward, who turned to him. He gently asked if she wasn't getting ready to leave, to which the girl replied that she had been detained by some passer-by, casting a contemptuous glance at Edward. Edward was perplexed. This is the man who was at the show, then. Is she really living with him? Angelica did not take her admiring eyes off Daniel, which infuriated her ex-husband more and more. Unable to control himself anymore, Edward screamed, "Why did this man leave her house?" They turned to him, and the girl contemptuously said that it was none of his business. Edward could not find words. He told his ex-wife that he couldn't be so slutty. He was interrupted by screams. Reporters pointed their fingers at them, and everyone wanted to get such a sensation. The former Madame Grand surrounded by another suitor. They ran up and vying with each other, putting out microphones, asking, pointing to Daniel, "This is her new, already 4th boyfriend." Then asking Daniel himself if he knows where Miss Angelica gets her income from. But the girl loudly and imperiously ordered to stop. Everyone froze. After a pause, she added that she would answer all questions at the company's anniversary celebration, and now she intends to ask her lawyer to sue them for trespassing. Then security jumped out and began to drive away the annoying reporters. Finally, the journalists were ushered out, and Edward, Daniel, and Angelique breathed a sigh of relief. Then the girl grinned and noticed that the Grand family's methods were so cheap that it was funny. Edward tried his best to assure that he had nothing to do with it and did not invite these journalists, but she turned around contemptuously and went with Daniel, saying that she didn't care. And on the front pages there is a photo of the three of them and a headline that Angelica has found herself a new home, and not even one. Under Edward's photo, some wrote that these rich people have no conscience, although this young Grand still has a little. Eugene, Chuck, and President Elphys were featured as the husbands of Angelica, who has a voracious appetite. Angelica's father was furious reading the news feed, comments throwing mud at her. He ordered the guards to go home to support his daughter. Angelica and Daniel were driving in the car, scrolling through the news feed on her phone. She learned a lot of new things about herself. The young man noticed how her face was changing and asked what happened. She sighed and replied that not only did these reporters write complete nonsense about her, but they also called him a gigolo. Angelique was very embarrassed that Daniel was drawn into her conflict with her ex-husband's family, and she apologized. But Daniel just grinned and said that everything was fine. This was new to him, and even fun. And I thought to myself that I was just happy that she was nearby. And then the girl suggested that he walk through the shopping center, since he had just returned to the city. Angelica enjoyed the signature tea, which was truly delicious here. Daniel went to buy some things for himself, so she was in no hurry. But when I heard the waiter inviting familiar names to come through, I wondered if these two bitches were also here. Laura and Ursula laughed at Angelica and the light in which she was portrayed on the internet, so they decided to celebrate it. But when she saw Angelica drinking tea, Laura screamed why she was here. After everything, she was not ashamed to go out. They approached her and Laura, grinning, sarcastically said how Angelica dared to go out in public, let her not disgrace the Grand family. Raising her head, the girl calmly answered, "Is she disgracing their family? Her brother cheated with Ursula. They conspired against her, and she has not yet taken revenge." But Ursula demanded that they stop slandering her brother, and Ursula, as usual, decided to play along, saying that it was clear that Angelica was very upset. But Angelica put on a boring face and besieged them by asking who was yapping there. The door clicked, and the girls turned their heads to see Daniel enter. He came up and said what a noise, but there was no fight. Ursula and Laura couldn't take their eyes off him. How handsome he was. They were filled with envy that he was with Angelica, and then a brilliant plan matured in Laura's head to take this handsome man away from Angelica, and then she would be beside herself with rage. Edward, not paying attention to them, asked Angelica how she liked his clothes that he had just bought. The girl covered her nose with her hand and said that the clothes were good, but they stank of garbage. And Edward asked if they could call the manager and he would take them out. Then they called him and he apologized and said that he would go answer the call. Laura followed him, deciding to put her plan into action. She stood behind the wall and waited for Daniel to finish the conversation. As soon as he hung up and was about to return to Angelica, Laura stopped him. When he asked what she wanted, the girl replied that she was the young mistress of the Grand family, although he already knew this, and Angelica was an ordinary beggar selling bodies. When he asked what she wanted, she pointed her finger at him as if he were an item in a store and told him to name whatever price he wanted to receive per month. She said that Laura did not have enough money to buy it. To finally finish her off, they called her a girl from a poor family who even had to sell her grandfather's antiques, leaving Laura, who was emanating from anger, to spit in anger. They walked out of the cafe laughing. After leaving the shopping center, Angelica apologized to Daniel for this whole situation. He asked these girls were always like this and what they needed from Angelica. She sighed and replied that yes, they constantly approach her and provoke her into a scandal. Daniel offered to help subdue him, but Angelique said she had a plan. Mentally replaying her revenge, she only added that he who laughs last laughs best. Then they decided to go eat and laughed at the fact that Daniel was now walking around with her in the official status of a gigolo. The girl was pleasantly surprised. The young man ordered only her favorite dishes. Looking at him, she felt pleased that he was so attentive. Daniel, understanding what she was thinking, said that Eugene told her about her preferences, and the girl joked that he was so cute that he had the potential to become a gigolo. Daniel responded laughing that as long as she was happy, he didn't mind being her. They clinked glasses of wine and decided to relax while enjoying delicious food. Louis saw them and told Edward that his ex was also here with her next groom. Edward turned around and saw Angelique and Daniel laughing, and his mood immediately darkened. He saw how happily Angelica looked at this man, how cheerful and free she was. This stranger who looked at his ex-wife with tenderness and love infuriated Edward. Louis said that this girl doesn't seem to care. She's criticized so much, but she's still dating this guy. It's good that Edward divorced her. Edward jumped up furiously before Louis had time to come to his senses. Appearing behind Angelica and Daniel, he told her that it didn't seem like it was too much. If she did it to piss him off, then she succeeded. They will never be together. Angelica coughed contemptuously. "He's here again and pestering me again." Daniel mockingly told Edward that he was indeed very narcissistic. He barked that he was not talking to him. The girl stood up and, looking at Edward, asked why he was shouting at the entire restaurant. His eyes were filled with anger. He muttered to Angelica what a creature she was. Daniel stood up and, covering it with himself, declared that President Grand would answer for his words. Angelica is their treasure. They will not allow anyone to look down on her. Edward didn't understand what he meant by calling his ex-wife a treasure. Daniel shook his head reproachfully, pointing out that not only did President Grand not appreciate and respect his wife, but now he is pestering her, or it hurts him so much that there are people who care about her. The girl stood and thought that her father and brothers loved her. What a fool she was, living as a servant in her ex's house. She didn't even want to look at the person who took away 3 years of her life and told Daniel that they were leaving, but he said that it was not they who needed to leave. Glancing contemptuously at Edward, he asked if it was President Grand. Edward left everything in anger as well, leaving lest they regret it. Daniel carefully asked the girl if she was okay. Angelica replied that she had fun. And here she is with Daniel on the front pages of online publications with the signature of Miss Angelica relaxing with a mysterious guy in an elite restaurant. Angelica was called a kept woman who grabbed a new sponsor, and the comments were bursting with anger and curses on all the luxurious rich people who can afford a beautiful life. The assistant asked Eugene if something needed to be done, because such news had a negative impact on the company's rating and shares. Angelica's middle brother called his sister and was glad that he was at the airport and returned home, wondering if she would pick him up. Angelica's third brother, Anthony, was a famous actor. Crowds of fans met him at the airport. He lowered his glasses and realized that his glory was shining everywhere. He read a message from his sister, who wrote that she would come for him soon. Laura and Ursula were also among his fans and shouted with joy when they saw him. She ran up and said how she could contact him. She had liked him for a long time. The guy was no stranger to it. But he said that he did not give out his contacts. But Laura introduced herself and said that her family are shareholders. It would be useful for him to have many friends. He looked closely at the girls and said that it was time for him to go. They stood in bewilderment, not knowing what to do now, but Laura was not going to give up so easily. But then Ursula took over her initiative, grabbing Laura and running after Anthony. The guy instantly turned into a happy child when he saw his sister and screamed, calling her name. She smiled joyfully. How long they had not seen each other. Within a second, they were cheerfully greeting each other in an embrace. Ursula and Laura stood in a state of shock, and here Angelica pushed them aside. She knows this favorite of all women, and not only does she know, they are in a very close relationship. Laura's consciousness was once again shaken, and not remembering herself, she screamed why the hell they were hugging. Angelica answered her brother without surprise. That's why he was delayed. He was bothered by all sorts of dirt. Laura screamed, how dare she insult her? She herself has so many men. This began to bring pleasure to Angelica. Seeing Laura's distorted face made her revenge for 3 years of humiliation sweeter. Therefore, bending her fingers, she replied that she was too talkative, and as for her men, she had countless of them. Laura, having completely lost touch with her mind, screamed that she would kill Angelica and ran up and swung her hand. But someone strongly stopped her hand. It was Anthony, the one she so dreamed of getting. He looked at Laura with cold contempt and said what she had just called Angelica and what she was planning to do. Laura stood in front of him on her knees, humiliated and crushed. Then the guy disdainfully threw her hand away and told Angelica that perhaps it was time to go. Laura could not get up. Tears of humiliation blurred her eyes. Ursula came up to her, watching her lament in impotent anger that everyone preferred this girl. Even Anthony was fooled by her and thought how pathetic and useless she was now. But she needed it, at least for now, and calming her down, she showed her the photo she had taken. The moment where Anthony hugs Angelica needs to be posted online, and his fans will do their job. Meanwhile, Anthony and Angelica returned home. Eugene was already looking forward to them. Anthony told how this grand family tried to insult him, Ange, as he liked to call his sister as a child, but he did not allow it. How he took his phone and saw that a bunch of messages were displayed with comments on how he would explain this. His fans threw mud at Angelica by writing that the Screen King's girlfriend turned out to be a divorcee thrown out by the Grand family. Angeli was also looking at the latest news about herself. Apparently, one of Anthony's fans took a photo of them. Angry, Anthony said that he would sort everything out and started dialing the number. But his sister stopped him, saying that the day after tomorrow was the company's anniversary, and during the holiday they would settle everything. On this long-awaited day, Angelica looked luxurious, anticipating what a sensation it would be. Already in the hall, they were whispering behind her back that this was the same girl who was seen with that actor and with another guy. No one wanted to approach her because of her reputation. She made eye contact with Edward. Approaching her, he displeasedly asked how she ended up here. Her self-will and carelessness infuriated him. Everyone was just waiting to laugh at her. Not deigning to honor him anymore, she turned around and was about to leave when he grabbed her hand. With the most decisive look, he told her not to encroach on the removal of President Eugene. Otherwise, he would not be able to do anything and protect her. Dismissively throwing his hand away, the girl chuckled. Well, of course, to protect her, but he was just afraid that his family would have problems because of his connection with her. She was infuriated by this man who caught her eye everywhere, and after everything dared to teach. Ursula approached with a languid look, and grabbing Edward's hand, muttered in a further. Now his speech will begin. He turned all eyes to President Suok. He thanked those present for visiting to celebrate the anniversary of his company. In truth, he organized this entire holiday in honor of his daughter. Everyone fell silent. The hall just froze. There was a question mark on everyone's faces. President Suoku has a daughter. Edward's thoughts raced through his head. Then it dawned on him. Just a second. Eugene, Anthony, the president of Suoku himself, and his daughter. Is it really her? A striking girl walked slowly up to the president, and everyone's eyes were on her. The president shook hands with his daughter to help her rise to him. It seemed at that moment the ground went out from under Edward's feet. This simply could not happen. It was Angelica, his ex-wife and daughter of President Suoku. The father officially introduced his daughter. The audience gasped. Is this really the same girl flashing on all the pages of publications? Edward, still motionless, tried to grasp reality. Ursula nervously fiddled with her hands. She was shaking slightly. Her mind refused to believe what she was seeing. President Suoku declared Angelica his heir and remarked about the criticism towards her. Having threatened all those who spread gossip about his baby, her enemies are his enemies. Angelica beamed and looked triumphantly at the guests with all her appearance, showing who she was. Edward and Ursula still stood paralyzed. Old Mr. Grand, Laura, and Grace contemplated with horror the one whom they had so much oppressed. Those present started talking about how everything was so unexpected. How could rumors be spread that Angelica and Eugene were lovers? They were brother and sister. The grand family came into view. A conversation began that it was they who were spreading the rumors. Laura could not stand what was happening and screamed that this could not be. Angelica was an ordinary orphan. President Suoku said that he was transferring all the shares of his company to his daughter. She is his successor. The grand family watched as Eugene approached Angelica and announced that he would also give his sister 10% of his shares and would also become president of the corporations. He took the microphone and also said that he would always be with his beloved sister. Eugene Suoku declared, just like his father, that those who offend his sister will have to deal with him. Angelica's speech was the last. Thanking her family for their support, she promised not to let her down. Someone in the crowd, looking at her admiringly, said that it looked like a book. It was simply incredible, the heiress of such a large corporation. Edward heard people discussing her marriage to Edward behind his back, agreeing that it was a mistake. The journalist asked Angelique whether it was true that her divorce from Mr. Grant meant a divorce between their families. Ursula, looking into Edward's eyes, stammered that Angelica, as his wife, would definitely understand him. Angelica looked with a smile at the guests surrounding her. Then she made a speech in which she mentioned that when she married Mr. Grant, it was not a business marriage, but a desire to go her own way. However, this marriage was a mistake. These words flashed pain in Edward's heart. Old Mr. Grant thought with contrition that if he had known who she was before, he would not have allowed her to get a divorce. After the end of the speech, Father, Eugene, and Angelica left the hall. There, distraught, Laura shouted that it was all a lie. She didn't believe them all. It didn't fit in Laura's mind how Angelica could have something that she herself didn't have, which is what she shouted out. Angelica asked not to be jealous and said that she had prepared several gifts in honor of the company's anniversary. Gift bags were brought into the hall for some of the event guests. She handed one to Laura, saying it was a limited edition. People groaned. This is a very expensive product, and it gives such gifts so easily. Unprecedented generosity, just like in the movies. Old Mr. Grant ingratiatingly ran up to Angelica's father, offering to talk face to face. But he declared that if he wants to say something, let him say it here. Unable to look at this outright flattery any longer, the girl ordered her to stop talking nonsense. And the very next minute, the guards led Ursula out by the arms, who called for Edward's help. Angelica herself turned to Edward's family and stated that if no official statements were received from them within 3 days, her company would terminate cooperation. They stood confused, but old Mr. Grant stammered that of course they would apologize. After Angelica's father said that the guests should be escorted out, thereby showing their attitude, they left. Only Edward paused. He asked Angelique to stop and talk. When she answered without turning around that there was nothing to talk about, he stopped her by grabbing her hand. Slapping the girl in the face, she loudly said not to dare touch her. The thought flashed through Edward's head that this was really the end. She knows what he wants to say. There is no need to consider everyone around him guilty, thinking that the world revolves only around him. Edward began to make excuses. He didn't think so. Now he was ready to do a lot so that Angelica would listen to him. At that moment, Daniel approached them with a joyful smile and asked Angelica if she was ready to celebrate the company's anniversary with him. The girl gasped in surprise. He managed to come to the event. A gloomy Edward watched as Daniel handed Angelica a gift and congratulated her on the start of a new life. Angelica asked if he again consulted with her brother about the gift. But Daniel refuted her speculations, saying that after so much time he had already studied all her preferences. Clenching his fists in anger, which gripped Edward like a fever, he watched as the last thread connecting him to her was torn. He remembered how in the hospital she made excuses, begged him to listen to her, but he was cold, only calculatingly asking how much she wanted for her blood. And now he was in her place, asking, pleading, but but she didn't want to know him. Edward silently began to leave, realizing that this was already the end. He had made too many mistakes. Daniel looked sideways at him and nodded at Angelica's ex-husband and asked what he wanted. The girl was clearly irritated by the mention of her ex and categorically said that it didn't matter. Ursula watched all this. Envy and resentment overwhelmed her. She bit her lips and wondered why. Why does all this Angelica, wealth, the best men follow her? She has so much everything. Why does she need Edward? She took out her phone with shaking hands. Having called, she told someone that she could act in the evening. This Angelica, how she hated her. She saw no other way out but to take her life. Hatred clouded everything. Ursula convinced herself that Angelica was to blame for everything. In the parking lot, Angelica found out that Daniel would need to leave for work. She felt sad to part with the man, but Daniel also noted that he did not want to leave. But for work, he needed to monitor the affairs of the company in another city. But he promised to return as quickly as possible. And they said goodbye. When the girl got into the car, they were following her. It was already quite late. As she left the parking lot, she noticed through the rearview window that a truck was moving behind her. He moved without stopping, intending to provoke an accident at the right moment. Angelica remained calm. The pursuer did not break away, even when she changed the route. What was wrong with this car? The girl thought with irritation. But she already understood that this car was following her for a reason. When she turned around and that truck was about to brake, she was blinded by the headlights. Then she saw that the car was moving towards her without thinking of stopping. At that moment, a white Range Rover appeared between her and the truck and took the hit. The airbag deployed, but Angelica still rocked violently. The door of her car was opened by Edward, who in a panic shouted if she was okay. Holding on to the bruised area, Angelica got out of the car, trying to comprehend what had just happened. To help her, he took her hand, but Angelica reacted negatively and ordered her to let go. She grinned internally. Funny, as soon as she found out that she was the heiress of a large company, she immediately began to show kindness. The girl could hardly stand on her feet. Her head hurt. Edward, holding her, offered to take her to the hospital. She looked at the cars and realized that it was his car that had blocked it from the impact. Apparently, Edward was following her. She didn't believe in such a coincidence. Angelica smiled more softly and thanked Edward. She didn't want to listen to anything about the hospital. Instead, she took out the phone, dialed someone, and told someone to come quickly. Someone hired a killer to arrange an accident for her. Edward's jaw dropped as he repeated her words about the killer in a trance. As she got back into the car, she asked him to pray that this was not connected to him. Edward tried to talk, to explain, but Angelica cut him off, demonstrating that she did not intend to discuss anything further. Then she took out a check and handed it to Edward and said that it was 10 million, 4 for the Range Rover, and 6 as a thank you. Edward stated that he did not help her for the money, but the girl put the check in his vest pocket and reminded him that when she donated blood, he didn't skimp. Now it's her turn. After waving her hand, she left, and the man, still not coming to his senses, looked after her. At the Grand's house, meanwhile, Laura was sobbing, wailing. Who thought that this little devil would be the heir to Swoku? The entire internet is against them. Shares are falling. Grandpa Grand hit her on the head with a cane, irritated by his granddaughter's screams about what they should do now. Of course they need to apologize and why his granddaughter is such a useless idiot. Grace calmed her daughter down, telling her father that he shouldn't do this to a child. But the old man said irritably that they thought he didn't know how they mocked Angelica. Grace was overcome with anger. A holy man had also been found, and he himself tormented Angelica worse than them. Old Gran said why Edward hasn't returned yet. Just at that moment, Edward came in asking what they had done here. Grace ran up to him and looked worriedly at her son's face, asking what happened to him. He replied that Angelica had an accident and he helped her. Laura, hearing these words, immediately perked up, saying that since her brother saved this girl, it means that now they are the saviors of the Swoku family, and they should be grateful to them. Edward lost his temper, calling his sister stupid. They should apologize to the Suoku family. The fact that he helped Angelica does not cancel anything. Old Grand, thinking about how best to take advantage of this situation, told his grandson not to cross paths with his ex-wife in public yet. We need to take advantage of this situation and restore relations with Angelica's family in order to get her back. After his grandfather's words that a connection with the Suoku family would be useful to them, Edward showed all the cynicism of his family. The man told his grandfather that, okay, Laura doesn't understand anything, but how can he say that himself? But the grandfather calmly explained that Angelica was just a woman. They had been divorced for so long, and Edward was still afraid to let her go. These words forced Edward to answer that this was all unreasonable and to leave. Grandfather grinned to himself. Angelica is still in love with Evard. If he obeys a little, she and her family will be at the feet of the Grands. The next day, Angelica read the news, where the Grand family officially apologized. The girl herself was called the new billionaire. But Angelica, of course, did not believe in the sincerity of the apology. At this time, the older brother entered, saying that they had a meeting. In the conference room, Eugene had already formally introduced Angelique as the controlling shareholder of their company. The girl made a short speech about how she hoped for a pleasant and productive collaboration. She was officially congratulated on joining the board of directors. Turning on the presentation screen, Angelica announced that the project she had previously led with Julie's group had begun selecting a research design. The chip appeared on the screen, and the girl said that she would personally monitor the research. And also people for the research team have already been selected. Eugene supported her for a job well done and wished her to forget about the Grand family and move on to new achievements. Angelica replied that she would make it clear that it was better not to mess with her. The phone rang. When the girl picked it up, she heard her brother's voice telling her that he was already at the airport. But Angelica replied that she would take revenge herself. They had a long-standing enmity. At this time, Edward and Louis were waiting in the airport's VIP room. They were waiting for Sanner, who was awarded an invitation from the U.S. High Technology Research Association. Many companies wanted to get him, but he returned home. Louis began to joke that apparently Edward's invitation brought the connoisseur home. Angelica entered the waiting room looking out for her brother. Seeing her, the men became nervous. Louis immediately suspected that Edward's ex wanted to intercept Sanner. Edward approached her and asked why she was here, but the girl snapped that it was none of his business. Louis jumped to his friend's aid, asking if Miss Suoku was going to intercept Sanner, since she would be heading the research project. Edward offered to introduce Sanner to her and introduce her, and Angelica, anticipating their future reaction, answered whether Sanner would go with them. Insulted, Louis shouted that even if she became the president of the Suoku company, this does not mean that she can win over Sanner. His plans and research coincide with Julie's research. A young man with glasses, Angelica Sanner's second brother, appeared at the airport. He got scared when Angelica jumped up and hugged him and said that he had finally arrived. Then, with a soft smile, he patted her on the head, saying that she was such an adult, but still a child. Watching this picture, Louis said how lucky Angelique is with guys. Edward was clearly annoyed, but Louis whistled that his friend had nothing to worry about. Edward was cooler than everyone else. But the next second he exclaimed, "Wait a minute, this is Sanner, Angelica's brother." He pulled Edward. Angelica got ahead of them. They need to come up and greet Sanner. Sanner asked Angelica what she wanted, since he was in a hurry and did not buy a gift. Then the girl asked to head her project related to artificial intelligence. Her brother patted her on the head as in childhood and assured her that, of course, he would never refuse her. They were interrupted by Edward's voice asking Mr. Sanner to wait. Sanner turned around and asked what was wrong, but Angelique asked Edward and Louis to stop following her. Edward came up and introduced himself, offering cooperation with the Grand Company. Sanner turned away without even shaking Edward's hand, declaring that he was not interested in cooperation. Angelica, enjoying the victory, joked with her ex that she could introduce him to Sanner. A few days later, Angelica arrived at the conference as the partner of President Elvis. He happily waved, inviting her to come up, and announced that he did not expect her to lead the team of the Suoku company. But Mr. Grand also led his company. Angelica was irritated by the mention of her ex-husband, but now, as two investors, they will have to intersect. Especially so that Edward could hear, she answered Elvis that she was not eager to deal with Mr. Grand, but she had work, so she would endure it. A quarrel began between Edward and Angelica. The ex-husband asked not to express himself that way, since they were partners. Angelica had the impression that President Elvis enjoyed being with Edward next to her, so she waved her hand irritably, declaring that she had nothing to discuss with him, and walked away. Elvis, slapping Edward on the shoulder, noted that after there should not mention the dead. This is a bad omen. Elvis and Edward stood like stones when she added that her ex was just a scumbag, and calling him a person was already a compliment. Restraining himself, Edward reminded Angelica that they were in the meeting room, and this was clearly not the place for a showdown. The girl retorted that Mr. Grand should become the director of the community on how to ruin the lives of others, because he knows how to do it very well. Edward threw it at her, and while he was searching for words, President Elvis worriedly asked not to swear. He reminded us that the conference would start soon. We needed to drink tea and get ready. When the conference ended and Angelica went to the restroom, Edward was waiting for her at the door. She pretended not to notice him as she was about to pass, but the man turned up and asked to talk. The girl boldly put him in his place, saying what status he has to talk to her. Looking straight into his eyes, Angelica, emphasizing her superiority, declared that neither in terms of finances nor in terms of status, he was not even worthy to wear her shoes. He took her hand and asked her not to make jokes, but he understands that he is still angry in his heart. Edward expressed that husband and wife are once spouses for life. Why fight and harbor hatred? The girl was enraged by his words. Then she reminded him how she was a maid in his house and a blood donor. She said that he is a hypocrite and behaves disgustingly. At that moment, Laura appeared and screamed. She had finally found Angelica. She ran up to her and said that they urgently needed to go to the hospital. Edward clarified what prompted his sister's visit here. She rattled off that Ursula had been in an accident. She was now in the hospital and needed a blood transfusion. Angelica looked expectantly at Edward. She would again ask for blood for this impudent person. And then she wanted to have fun and once again get even with Ursula. And turning around, she said, "Let's go to the hospital." At this time in the hospital, Ursula told the doctor, whom she paid well, how and when to photograph her with Edward so that they would look like a couple and get on the pages of the newspapers. And if he films her putting Angelica in her place, and she stands there embarrassed and generally sobbing, then the payment will double. When everyone entered the room, Ursula sat in her usual image of a sufferer, and Laura said that she brought Angelica to donate blood for her dear friend. Angelica watched this picture expectantly, without saying anything. When Ursula plaintively moaned her name, she walked up to her bed and asked the doctor what happened to this patient. He explained that this girl had a fractured hip, so she would need 400 cc of blood of the same type. Ursula bleated pitifully that she admired Angelica, that despite all the insults she would donate blood for her. She would ask Edward to thank her. Angelica, with a sharp movement, threw her purse onto the blanket, saying that she would break all her bones for this performance. Ursula's face was distorted with anger, and our heroine triumphantly asked the doctor why there was no reaction if, as he said, the patient's hip was broken. And a second later, she pulled the blanket off the pretender, where everyone saw that there was no cast or bandages. Contemptuously, Angelica stated how convenient it is to pretend to be sick, hide behind accidents in order to arouse pity, and also order murders. She leaned towards Ursula's face, who was covered in sweat from fear and surprise at this turn of events. Laura accused Angelica of having an evil character, and that Robert, his late friend, Angelica sarcastically said behind his back whether President Grand would cover up the murderer. Then Edward was stopped by a policeman and, leaving the room, asked Ursula whether she tried to kill Angelica, yes or no. Everyone saw Ursula's eyes running around. She was trying to answer something, and Edward, seeing her off with a cold gaze, said that he understood everything. Ursula was taken away. She shouted that Robert would be sad in heaven if Edward did not help her. After leaving the room, Angelica wished the members of the Grand family to check their heads for abnormalities. On the front pages of the publications was Ursula, who was called Edward's new lover. And in the comments, the guy admitted that tomorrow was the anniversary of his brother's death, and he didn't want to go to the cemetery alone. He was embarrassed to ask to go with him to the cemetery, but the girl understood everything. Of course she will go with him. Just let her not cry in secret, but give vent to her feelings. She remembered how her brother loved to joke with him, and Chuck realized how much he missed it now. Angelica saw that her friend was having a hard time and tried to cheer her up with all her might. At that moment, old Mr. Grand approached her and said that because of her, their shares fell by as much as 2 points. The girl grinned and answered yes. So what? This is her gift to them. The old man shouted in a creaky voice that we were talking about 300 million. As she kicked him out of the room, she said to ask her granddaughter and her friend, "Don't consider her a weakling." And she added that 300 million is just the beginning. Next time she should expect bankruptcy. At home, old man Grand again beat Laura with his cane, calling her stupid, a fool, and she resisted and screamed while she was taking the rap for all the punctures. Edward was also not a gift. Having heard about himself, he dialed the number and replied that her problem was that her convolutions in her head had long been dead, because at least one had to be used. Laura looked at her brother angrily and reminded him that it was he who had a long relationship with Ursula. Ordering her to shut up, the man told his sister that if Angelica did not accept her apology, she would pack her things and leave the house, and he would forget that he had a sister. It worked. All the arrogance left her, and a minute later, she was begging her brother on her knees and was ready to do whatever he said. Angelica heard screams under the window and came up to see who was there. When she left, she saw Laura, who was screaming that it was all her fault and asking for forgiveness. Edward and Laura stood at Robert's grave the next day, Ursula wailing about how well Edward took care of her. Edward, performing the ritual part of the commemoration of the deceased, told her that when everything was resolved, Ursula would leave the country. Bringing the handkerchief to her face, she sobbed, watching his reaction, and wished that after her departure, his relationship with Angelica would improve. At this time, Angelica and Chuck approached, who were surprised by the presence of Edward and Ursula at Robert's grave, and Angelica teased Ursula that the killer was walking free. Edward told Chuck that he was his brother's comrade in arms and promised to take care of Ursula, his girlfriend, before he died. Laying flowers on the grave, Angelica said that no one was interested in his explanations. Ursula clung to Edward's legs, begging for help. Now she decided to throw all the blame on Angelica, that it was all because of her. She provoked her. What amazement appeared in her eyes when Edward stepped after Angelica. For the first time in all time, he chose his ex-wife. Approaching her, he asked if she was okay, but Angelica did not believe in his sincerity, which she informed Edward about. Ursula screamed and with a distorted face complained about the injustice, why Angelica had so much money, love, and she still wanted to take her Edward away. Angelica advised her to stop acting out. She walked up to the car. Ursula was still sitting confused, and Edward was silent expectantly. In the car was a bag containing evidence that Ursula had hired a hitman. She threw photographs of Ursula, the killer, at their meeting at the customer's feet. Ursula, in panic and frenzy, stared at the photo of her handing money to the killer. All she could do was confusedly repeat, interrupted by tears, that this was Photoshop. Edward, who until the last moment tried to find at least some clue to her innocence, looked at the photo. She crawled up to Edward and begged him to believe her, because he had promised Robert. Edward was seized with anger at himself. All this time he was warming the snake on his chest, which was the cause of so much pain for Angelica. Meanwhile, Angelica called the police saying that she found the killer in the parking lot near the cemetery. Then she told Edward that she called the police and hoped that Mr. Grand would not make the same mistake again. Edward watched as she got into the car and drove away, and Ursula still held on to him. She still had hope that not everything was lost. Looking at her, Edward said coldly that taking care of her had cost him too much, and when the time comes, he will explain everything to Robert in heaven. Now let her rely only on herself. Ursula couldn't believe what she heard. She always got away with everything. He left, and Ursula screamed at his pity that she had only him left. He drove away without saying another word, and she screamed his name, still sitting helplessly in the parking lot. Angelica and Marta were relaxing at the club, deciding to relax and have a good time together. Martha offered toast after toast that they had finally gotten rid of Ursula. Then she whispered that she would soon bring the boys. Let Angelica choose anyone. She would pay for everything. But our heroine just snorted. Was she really still interested in that? Martha stood up and said that she would go and say hello to the manager and let Angelica have fun. At that moment, a guy approached her and boldly said that he had heard a lot about her. In life, she was even more beautiful than in the photo. Angelica, without deigning to look at him, sat on the phone and did not pay attention to him. He sat down next to her, offering her a drink. He would pay for everything, and he himself thought that President Grand was upstairs, and now he would teach this lady a lesson and approach Edward. He kept talking about her beauty and asked her to choose anything from a drink. He was infuriated that the girl didn't even look at him. She just told him she didn't drink. Then he brought the glass right in front of her eyes, saying that such an influential woman like her needs to relieve stress. Another second, and the glass with its contents was poured by Angelica on the head of the annoying stranger. He grimaced and screamed, his eyes widening at her. The girl imperiously asked who he was to behave like that with her. The impudent one shouted that she was just a woman who was thrown out of the Grand family. What she thought about herself. He understood the hand and threatened to teach her a lesson, but felt the blow on himself. Edward kicked him with all his might and slammed him when he was on the floor. He asked Angelica if she was okay, but the girl put her hand on him and stopped him. A gleam of revenge appeared in her eyes and, leaning towards the amazed guy, she told him that the divorced woman was going to bankrupt his family. Then, defiantly folding her hands on her chest, she turned away from Edward. Edward asked her if they couldn't just be friends. How long could they hold grudges? The girl flared up and turned to him with the words that belated love is not worth a penny. So she walked all over Edward, trampled on his pride and self-esteem. She trampled Ursula, simply destroyed her. She won't bother her anymore. The girl saw herself in the image of a queen, a luxurious woman who walks over her enemies. The whole Grandhomme family is no longer at her feet, but under them. And what next? The girl smiled. This is the end. No, this is just the beginning of her journey. Angelica saw herself on the throne. Wealth. This was her goal, her path to become the richest woman in the world. Hugging the soft cat, the girl was in an ecstasy of pleasure. Anthony came in, smiling, watching his sister lying around with a toy in her arms. Angelica, yawning, answered on what question he was tearing her out of her sweet dreams, and her brother said that he did not have a companion for the charity evening. Would she like to join him? Angelica closed her eyes and mumbled something incomprehensible. Then her brother whispered that today an American 10-carat diamond necklace would be exhibited, and he would buy it for her as a reward. Before she had time to answer the hands, a team of stylists was already standing behind her to create the image. She and Anthony came to the charity evening nodding, greeting people she knew according to all the rules of etiquette. The girl liked the pearl earrings, and her brother asked if she wanted them. He would buy them without any problems. Angelica was pulled out of looking at the jewelry by a familiar voice asking if President Suoko was also here. What a coincidence, though. It was Louis who heard in response that this was not a coincidence, but a failure. Having failed, he returned to Edward's table, reporting that Angelica was now so popular and also with a movie star in public, but did not want to talk. But before Louis had time to leave, a girl appeared, and looking at Anthony with loving eyes, groaned as if they had not seen each other for a long time. Surprised, the guy asked who she was. She winked and reminded her that she had starred in an advertisement for skincare products, and they had crossed paths with him. Angelica decided to tease her brother and winkingly asked if it was his girlfriend, to which Anthony denied everything. The girl did not appreciate the humor and capriciously asked Angelica who she was and why she was sitting with her friend. Anthony ordered the stranger to watch her tongue, and she embarrassedly tried to explain herself when they announced the start of the auction. The girl sat down with Angelica and Anthony, who were clearly unhappy. The first lot was announced to be an American 10-carat diamond necklace with a starting price of $1 million. Anthony offered $1,500,000. Before the presenter had time to ask who would give more, the stranger offered $2 million. An intense race for the necklace began between her and Anthony, and Angelica became bored. She looked at this girl and was amazed at her stupidity, which she could not even hide, whispering to his brother that if that capricious woman likes this necklace, and the stone there is not even rare, then let her take it. Anthony agreed. The girl, with a face twisted from resentment, looked like a child to whom they had stopped paying attention as Anthony and Angelica exchanged words. The brother and sister looked like a couple in love. Miss Julia, who bought the necklace, didn't even hear the congratulations. Her anger was growing with every second. Ready to burst into tears, she jumped up, hit the table with her fist, then yelled at Angelica and Anthony that they were doing this. She already considered Angelica the main obstacle to marriage with her beloved Anthony, which she announced publicly. Having slapped Angelica in the face, she accompanied all this with a shrill cry of "How dare she, vixen, seduce her sweetheart!" A frightened Anthony jumped up and rushed to his sister. Angelica slowly stood up from her seat. She had such a look that Julia took a frightened step back. Then she hit the madwoman so hard that she flew back before she could come to her senses. She, not expecting a response, and even such a strong blow, almost lost her balance and fell to the floor. Angelica said that the sick fool needed treatment. Julia apparently received a rebuff for the first time in her life. Surprise, resentment, and fear were visible on her face. She shouted to Angelica that she didn't know who she dared to hit, to which she replied, "Tit for tat, what a problem." But the girl considered herself inviolable, so she screamed that she would destroy Angelica and rushed at her, shouting that she was the daughter of the financial director of the Sinai Group, but she would destroy her. Anthony jumped up and was about to intercept, but he was ahead of him. Edward grabbed Julia, who was confused by the fact that this was the second person who dared to stop her. While she was trying to escape, Edward turned to Anthony, saying that he was not able to deal with his girls. What kind of man was he? Then he disgustedly pushed Julia away, winced and said what an abomination, and so incomprehensibly asked who the fuck he was. And then she screamed that everything was clear to her. He was supporting her, meaning Angelica. Otherwise, why was she so worried? Anthony covered his sister from an inadequate girl, and she insulted Angelica with a dirty woman entangling Anthony in her dirt. Then Angelica, pushing her brother aside, came up and hit the girl even harder than the first time. Then she asked if she was finished, and if so, did they know each other that she was so angry? Then, with an icy look, she approached Julia and said that it was time to introduce herself. Taking her head, she introduced herself as the main heiress of the Suoku family, and with her family's finances, she could buy 10 so-called financial groups. Julia screamed that there was no need to threaten her. She still didn't believe it. But when she heard voices in the hall and the mention of the power of the Suoku Company, which could crush such a small company as Julia's, her arrogance began to fall from her. Well, when she realized that the girl she insulted and hit was the same Angelica Suoku, she realized that she was in complete trouble. Angelica's look spoke for itself and did not bode well. As we passed, our heroine promised Julia the end of the life of the oligarch's daughter. For the first time in her life, Julia understood what punishment was. With a grimace, she began to persuade Angelica not to do this, but she passed away smiling. Anthony said, addressing his sister half seriously, half jokingly, that there was no need to scare Mrs. Julia. Then, approaching Julia, who was looking at him with hope as her only salvation, the guy added that he had not yet had time to introduce himself. And when she heard that in front of her was Angelica's brother, who also added that he did not envy her ending, she realized that this was the final ending. The guy laughed without saying anything else, and she stood there motionless. Then, casually waving his hand goodbye, he turned and followed his sister, hoping that they would see each other again. The recent brawler sat on the floor looking at one point, and Edward followed Angelica and Anthony with his eyes. And remembering him, Angelica mockingly and deliberately spoke loudly about popularity. And looking into the eyes of her ex-husband, she said that before teaching others, you need to look at yourself. Edward couldn't find the words to respond. He just remained silent. Finally, Angelica reminded him of what a scumbag he is. Taking their brother by the arm, they headed towards the exit, talking about something of their own. The day of the meeting arrived in the company of Julie. President Elvis, Angelica, and Edward gathered in the meeting room. Silence reigned in the hall, and Elvis, addressing Angelica, said that he had heard that all the products of the Sinai Financial Group were returned due to smuggling, worthy of the Suoku family, so cruelly. Without taking her eyes off her papers, the girl coldly answered the director that during working hours, she only talks about business. He decided to defuse the situation and added with a mock laugh that who would have thought that the famous film actor would turn out to be Angelica's brother? He then cast a sly glance at Edward, asking if he was speaking correctly. Angelica began to be enraged by the behavior of President Elvis, who was enjoying the picture while checking the reaction of the former spouses to each other. When the girl wanted to get up and leave, the president stopped her and said that their products had already reached the finished product stage and it was time to prepare a press conference and report it. At that moment, the door opened and an employee rushed in, yelling at President Elvis that they had problems. Everyone was alarmed, and a sweaty employee reported that the Suoku branch in the city of Norton was ahead of the curve with the announcement of smart chips. Everyone turned to Angelica expecting an explanation from her. Looking into her eyes, Angelica unwaveringly stated that she could guarantee that she had never disseminated information about this project. Edward was the first to speak out about the fact that a mole had appeared in their team, and they needed to identify it as soon as possible. The girl replied that she would go to Norton herself and sort everything out, but here she had two trusted business partners. And then Edward decided that he should not miss this opportunity to improve relations with her, declaring that he would go with her. When he stood up and said that he would go with her, she snapped that there was no need for that. Edward insisted that 3 companies had screwed this up, and she couldn't handle it alone. Edward's intentions did not escape President Elvis, so he supported his idea with a smile, and he himself would control the public reaction here. Angelica thought for a while, but realized that it would be better this way, and agreed. But Edward never expected that she pressed the papers to his chest and declared to study them. She also added that he did not get in her way. He calmly replied that he would not. He himself thought that he would not disappoint her. Meanwhile, Professor Mike, an AI specialist, presented the development of a nanochip. Angelica opened the door and entered the conference room, followed by Edward. The girl demanded to stop the presentation, Everyone knows that a joint laboratory of 3 families is developing smart microcircuits. Snatching the microphone from the professor, the girl angrily said, "Since when did her and her partner's research become the personal development of Professor Michael Soule?" At this time, filming was taking place in the hall. Angeli demanded an immediate explanation. The professor, clearly nervous, shouted that this was his project, and she shouldn't interfere if she doesn't understand what scientific research is. Then he began to demand that Angelica be taken out by security. When the guards approached, Edward blocked the passage to Angelica with his hand, ordering her to stand. Michael Soule screamed hysterically, who allowed them to arrange a showdown at his press conference. He will complain. Angelica supported him regarding the complaint, saying that she would just tell him about the theft. At that moment, a man appeared in a calm tone, asking what they were sharing here. It was a relative of the Swoku family, Albert, saying that everything that belongs to the Swoku family belongs to them all. Then he said that he had not seen Angelica for so long, but she was still as hot-tempered. Edward looked at the man in bewilderment as Angelica said that her uncle needed to know about the unauthorized disclosure of corporate secrets and plagiarism, but did not finish. And then, in an icy voice, she added that it was time to change the president of his branch. The professor and Angelica's relative did not hesitate to say that what she calls plagiarism is market capture and the ability to take advantage of opportunities that others missed. But the girl did not listen to them any further, but demanded proof that this was not plagiarism. After which she announced that here in 3 days they would publicly prove everything. The relative, smiling slyly, replied that this was a bad idea. Angelica's words sounded completely unconvincing. Angelica's subsequent words that if they could provide evidence, she would give her position to a relative made Edward numb. They were filmed on camera, Edward addressing her. President Suoku asked not to get excited, but Angelica replied that this was only the position of the president. Edward expressed his sincere readiness to help her, if only she would not talk so seriously about the position of president. But our heroine turned around and left, saying that she didn't need help. Angelica talked with her older brother, who said that he had sent her help. It was Daniel, who greeted the girl with the same soft and bewitching smile. How timely, how much she needed him, she sincerely exclaimed with joy when she saw him. The guy said that he had collected all the necessary information. Now he needed to check everything. They entered the restroom and began to sort out the papers. How could he be on time? To which Daniel assured that he would always be there when she needed help. And he added to himself that he would not allow her to fall into the trap of an unhappy marriage again. After some time, a suspicious report was discovered. The account for it did not add up, which was suspicious. The girl peered, and Daniel explained that in his opinion, there was a problem with depositing funds. Angelica smiled contentedly. There is no report on this deferred amount. It seems her uncle is laundering government money. She intended to continue the investigation for which Daniel called her an inveterate workaholic. When he announced the reconciliation of the next documents, the girl had already fallen asleep. He looked at her sleeping, admiring the strength and resilience of this fragile girl. He mentally thought that it was clearly uncomfortable to sleep on the table and took the sleeping Angelica in his arms. Carefully, so as not to wake her, he laid her on the bed. Then he carefully covered her with a blanket, and in her sleep she smiled. When he left her hotel room, Edward stood nearby and asked why Daniel was leaving Angelique's room. And then he strictly asked what kind of relationship they had. But Daniel missed the question about relationships and asked a counter-question. Edward came to Angelica. Then he added with a smile that President Grand would have to come tomorrow. She was already asleep. The day of the press conference arrived. When Angelica left her room, Edward was waiting for her, asking her to stop. An irritation appeared on her face that he wanted. Then Edward said that yesterday he saw Daniel leaving her room, and they faltered. She coldly replied that she did not have to account for her actions and her personal life. He followed her, asking if she wanted to explain anything. She rudely replied that she didn't. Professor Michael, hearing their squabble, laughed. The conference has not yet begun, and they are already quarreling. Then Angelica smiled and advised him not to be so self-confident. And she can deal with such a scumbag like him herself. He grimaced at the sight of the girl, who nonchalantly waved her hand at him that they would soon meet at a press conference. Angelica walked out of the building and walked towards the parking lot. She looked a little confused when a car appeared in front of her. It was Daniel who greeted her and invited her to give her a ride. How well Angelica answered and thanked the man. He always appears at the right moment. Before she could sit down, Edward was catching up with her, who was furious at the thought that she was constantly with this guy. Edward argued that she was making a mistake by involving strangers in the business of their company. Daniel replied with a charming smile that he was President Suoku's personal driver today, or she didn't deserve a driver. Our heroine added ironically, "Well, Mr. Grand sees her only as a bag of blood and nothing more." The car quickly drove away, and Edward once again watched his ex-wife leave with someone else. He had nothing to object to. He had made a lot of mistakes, she was right. But she needed to find a way for her to change her opinion about him. In the break room, Angelica listened to Professor Michael's recording. He took the position that his invention was the envy of many, so he would not back down. Sanner, pouring coffee, asked his sister not to pay attention to this clown. The girl replied with a smile that she hoped that he would still be able to laugh. And now Angelica is already in the conference room. Reporters are vying with each other, asking questions about this plagiarism scandal. How can she explain what the professor said about a design process similar to that of her company's branch? The girl said that her relative Albert's company made a mistake by plagiarizing the early results of their trilateral cooperation. An internal review found that her relative's company did engage in improper competitive practices. Her uncle and the professor turned white after she said that Suoku's company had already submitted a report on the bankruptcy and reorganization of the Norton branch. Her company would never put up with anything like that. The camera caught Albert, who denied all the charges. Why on earth does she have no evidence? But the girl continued by saying that the investigation also showed that the smart chip that the professor was talking about was just a failed product. And she introduced the main figure of the investigation, the scientist who received the highest gold award in the professional field, her brother Sanner. After returning home, he began working at the best research institute in the country, and Professor Michael Soule became his new colleague. Sanner continued by stating that he had surveillance video of Professor Michael stealing data from his computer, and in these data there were just unsuccessful calculations he had already reported to the police. At this time, Albert shook his unlucky partner, asking where the recording came from. He said that everything was done cleanly. The professor tried to answer something, but he stammered more, admitting complete defeat. At this time, the police had already entered the hall and charged both of them with suspicion. Angelica ironically wished her uncle good luck, since embezzlement of 100 million could result in a life sentence. The relative growled her name, making it clear that he would find a way to take revenge on her. President Elvis admired the girl. He didn't think that she would be able to solve such a complex problem so easily. How cleverly she was able to get out of such a situation. Edward shared his admiration. She is simply smart. How he admired and was proud of her now. Here she stands in front of everyone, confident and unshakable. Without taking his loving gaze away, Edward said that she was cool. When Albert was taken away by the police, he struggled and shouted to Angelica that he would kill her. Having escaped from the police, he, like an animal, jumped up to Angelica, ready to grab her, but Sanner blocked the girl. The police asked the suspect to calm down. The girl looked at him and said that she would see what he was capable of. When she and Daniel were walking to the car, he, worried about her, suggested that she assign a security guard, but she refused. This is exactly the effect she was trying to achieve. He looked at Angelica and could not hide his admiration. She really is not afraid of anything. Having unlocked the car, they were going to go and get something to eat after such a stressful day. She smiled and added that this time dinner was at her expense. At that time, a car stopped next to her. The window was lowered and she saw Edward, who invited her to sit in his car, as there was soon an important meeting on their project. Edward addressed her officially as President Suoku. Elvis once again enjoyed the moment when Edward challenged his ex-wife, whom he could not forget. He emphasized that since everything had been resolved with plagiarism, it was necessary to discuss it with the employees. Santa replied that everything was fine, don't worry about him, but she herself would eat well before the meeting. The girl glanced sideways at President Elvis and her ex-husband, thinking for a couple of seconds. Then she contacted Director Elvis, who said that the company had released an official statement explaining the situation, and this statement coincides with her statement, so she will not attend the meeting. Still smiling, Elvis said, "Well, Suoku is president. How can that be?" Calling on the fact that she is one of the founders of the company. Edward interjected his opinion that Director Elvis was right. Besides, everything that happened is connected with the Suoku family name. But Angelica stopped him. He didn't have to say this. And if anyone had questions for her, they should call her, and she would explain everything. Then she turned around and went to Daniel. The guy was surprised, and Angelica laughed and said, "What are we standing for? Let's go to dinner." He was sincerely happy and replied, "Of course, let's go." Elvis, observing Edward's gloomy appearance, said that it seemed that he could not keep his ex, and that boy with her was okay, to which Edward ordered to go after them. A meat dish was placed on the table, but Daniel said they would order soup first to warm up. Angelica was very pleased with his concern, and she joked that today he was again playing the role of a gigolo accompanying a rich mistress. Daniel replied that as long as Ange liked it, he would do whatever put aside her arrogance. She then turned to Daniel and commanded that they leave. Daniel turned to Edward and spoke slowly and intently, looking into his eyes. "It doesn't matter what food someone eats. The most important thing is that Ange likes this food. If after living with her for 3 years, he still didn't understand this, then someone else will understand." Edward stood up so loudly that Director Elvis became nervous, but he had nothing to object to his opponent. And Angelica and Daniel were already leaving without looking back. Edward was so angry at Daniel that he unfastened his tie in an attempt to breathe freely. Elvis, while drinking wine, hinted to him that it was immediately clear that he had never courted girls, to which Edward replied that Director Elvis had ideas. "Of course there is. Now, when his ex ignores him, his flashes before her eyes only irritate her. You need to start with what she likes, please her desires, and gradually improve the relationship, and he will tell you about step number 2 later." Edward thought about satisfying the desires that Angelica liked. A few days later, Angelica held a red envelope especially for a limited circle of invitees. The girl gasped, "This is an invitation to a famous world business conference." When she found out that this invitation was sent by her ex-husband to make amends, she was even more surprised. "This is a private meeting limited to 10 people from all over the world." Ha! And Edward suddenly became generous. Why would that be? She couldn't refuse this opportunity, so she went. Her assistant was driving her to the airport and asked if it would be too generous to give the grand family land in the west of the city. But the girl explained that this conference would help her family open the European market, so part of the land was simply an equal exchange. He understandingly agreed and replied that he would tell his employees to develop a plan for further action to develop the European market. When they arrived at the airport, the assistant suggested that Angelica rest in the lounge while he checked in. They were closely followed from the beginning of the journey to the airport, and when the assistant left, the man in black moved after Angelique. Her relative Albert could not calm down with the fact that Angelique became the reason for the ruin of his family. When the girl in the restroom relaxed while listening to music, he brought a rag with chloroform to her face. The girl did not understand what happened and lost consciousness. When Albert was dragging her out of the room, the assistant just returned and shouted who he was and what he was doing with Madame Angelique. He only ordered silence. Some of the passengers in the room looked at what was happening in disbelief. Pulling out a knife and bringing it to the girl's face, he shouted that no one should come near, otherwise he would kill her. Then he ordered the assistant to tell her family that they had brought 10 billion and arrived at a warehouse in the suburbs, otherwise they would only receive her corpse. The assistant stood in complete confusion. The room was filled with a rumble, where the guards were, or maybe this kidnapping was again organized by this grand family. Albert brought her to the warehouse, tied her to a chair, and splashed her with water to wake her up. At first, when the girl opened her eyes, she did not immediately understand what had happened. But when she saw Albert, she understood everything. He grinned. Here she was, sitting tied up and helpless. She never expected to fall into his hands. In anger, he grabbed her hair so much that Angelique screamed, accusing her of ruining his life. His family, everything because of her. He hit her in the face. But the girl, in turn, asked who was to blame for the fact that he was stealing public money, so he got what he deserved. He boiled over these words and attacked her with a knife, shouting that she still imagines herself as the president of Suoku, so he can kill her right now and take the money. Then she said that all the shares were registered in her name. If she died, the Suoku company would automatically donate everything to those in need. At this moment, her name was shouted by Edward and Daniel, who opened the door. Albert, shouting that no one should come near him, put a knife to Angelique's throat. Daniel asked the conditions under which Albert would release Angelica, and Edward said that everything was cordoned off by the police. This led the kidnapper to panic, but he demonstrated his main trump card. He had nothing to lose. Edward moved forward, but Daniel stopped him, pointing out Albert's condition. He could harm Angelique. First, we need to discuss everything outside. The police were outside, and Angelica's entire family had arrived. The father and brothers were in a panic. They wanted to know that Angelica was okay, that Albert had not harmed her. Daniel explained the situation, that Angelica was fine, but Albert was not himself, so there was no point in provoking him. He suggested that everyone stay outside and he would go inside, but Edward resolutely volunteered to go. He participated in peacekeeping activities. Everyone looked at each other. Someone wanted to object, but no one openly contradicted. Edward unbuttoned his jacket, saying that there were no objections. He was coming, and he headed towards the entrance to the warehouse, thinking that he would help Angelica at least once. Albert, meanwhile, mocked the girl by telling her that those who came to save her simply left, and she was not doing so well. She retorted that she was clearly better than him. She would not get a life sentence. These words infuriated him, and he kicked her with a swing, and the girl fell off the chair. He expressed himself in the last words that it was all because of her. She ruined his life. Angelica saw boxes next to which there were 3 bottles. The sight of her tied up and lying on the floor caused the kidnapper to burst into hysterical laughter. She looked like a beaten dog, he said. But all possible variations on how to save her life flashed through her head. Albert offered to beg him. Maybe if he was in a good mood, he would let her go. But the girl sent him with his proposal. He was infuriated by Angelica's arrogance. Even in such a situation, she was not broken. At this time, Eugene was in touch with the police, who reported that they would be here soon. The elder brother also said that he would contact the air rescue team to avoid unforeseen circumstances. Albert grabbed Angelica by the hair so that she screamed in pain. Taunting the girl, he asked what it was like when none of the relatives came to help. But Angelica did not lose heart. Without fear, she answered that she would not allow him to get a penny from her family, which provoked Albert's aggression. He hissed maliciously, "Everything here is filled with gasoline, so they will leave together." Using her feet, she kicked him in the face. The kidnapper, who did not expect this, recoiled. His cheek was still tormented by the blow. He raised his hand to this place, calling her a creature. He decided to act. But he didn't have time to do anything when Edward opened the door with a sharp blow and flew into the room. Albert grinned. "Come on, this is a grand director. He came to save his ex-wife." Raising the knife and about to slash Angelica, he said the hero came to save his princess. With a decisive tone, Edward was ready to listen to Albert's conditions. The girl sat in tension, not taking her eyes off her relative, trying to seize the right moment. While he began to lay out what he wished for the life of President Suoku, Angelica managed to take a piece of broken glass, and she tried to cut the rope that tied her hands. Albert's condition was 500 million transfer now. Angelica raised her voice, declaring that Edward would not try to transfer money. He still would not let her go. In a rage, he swung a knife at Angelica, who closed her eyes in anticipation of the blow. Edward screamed her name in horror. It was clear that Albert was losing control. But when he saw Edward approaching, he fearfully ordered not to move or he would kill the girl. Once again, the sharp blade of the knife touched her neck. Albert warned that next time he might not stop and ruin her face. Edward stopped. He was feverishly wondering what to do best. Albert, seeing his confusion, said that he likes to do business with such straightforward people as President Grand. He will transfer the money right now. Angelica understood that the criminal would still not let her out alive. Her only salvation was to free her hands. "We need to act quickly. We can't let Edward fall into this trap." Edward entered the account number, the amount. All that remained was to click confirmation of sending. Albert couldn't wait for the money to arrive. As with Director Grand, everything was simple and open. The transfer was completed. Edward watched expectantly as Albert looked at the result of the transaction with a satisfied smile. And at that moment, he jumped up and punched him in the face with his fist, saying, "Unlike you, I have everything according to my conscience." Albert's face expressed a mixture of rage, confusion, and powerlessness. He screamed at Edward like a wounded animal. With another deft kick, he knocked Albert to the floor. He did not have time to come to his senses, screaming in pain, but Edward did not give him the opportunity to get up. He stepped on Albert's hand and he howled in sharp pain. Edward barely restrained the desire to beat him on the spot, but pulled himself together and said that he would settle accounts with him later. He ran up to Angelica asking if everything was okay with her. He would help her free herself. He looked at her tied hands angrily, saying that he would never forgive this creature for doing this to her. While he was untying the girl's hands, Albert stood up, swaying from the effects of the blows. In his eyes, one could read the complete madness of a man who had nothing to lose. And he struck the wheel of the lighter with the words that they forced him to do this. Meanwhile, Edward freed Angelique's hands, and she thanked him for his help. At that moment, a deafening explosion was heard. Everything behind them was engulfed in fiery flames. There was horror on the faces of Edward and Angelica. They realized that Albert had taken extreme measures. He stood with a knife and laughed with a crazy smile. They wanted to leave so easily. It wouldn't work. And he rushed with a knife at Angelica with wishes to die. Edward covered her with himself. The girl opened her mouth, but from the horror of what was happening, she could not utter a word. A cautious cry escaped from his chest. Edward covered it with himself when in the blink of an eye, Albert ran up to them with a knife. The light of the metal flashed, and Albert plunged the knife into Edward's back. He swayed but did not retreat from Angelica, hugging her and covering her with his body. Then he took his hand with his other hand. A sharp pain pierced his body. There was a roar in his ears. From somewhere far away, he heard the voice of Angelica shouting his name to the lice. Edward croaked that he was guilty of what he had done before. Now he would do everything to protect her. Angelica held him back, saying that she was not the same victim. First, they need to get out of here. Behind them, they heard Albert, who said not to even dream about it. Edward was in unbearable pain. He laid his head on Angelique. The fire was getting stronger. He asked her to leave him here. Without losing control and composure, she looked in anger at the relative who had driven them into this situation. Having carefully seated Edward and told him not to move, our heroine was determined to get out alive. Standing opposite Albert, full of strength and courage, Looking at him contemptuously, she declared how such scum could be born in their family. Remembering her old tricks, she suddenly jumped up to the dumbfounded Albert. Another second and her knee hit him in the solar plexus, so that he wheezed from pain in his chest. He doubled over, unable to straighten up from the pain, and Angelica commented on her blow. It was for stealing money. Albert was losing control of his consciousness. He felt so bad. Then, with the movement of the fighter, she kicked the relative who had just gotten to his feet. This is number 2 for her abduction. He lay next to the fiery flame at her feet. The girl said, looking at him, that he was a nuisance to society. It was his big mistake to get out of prison. Blood oozed from his twisted face, and he called her a creature and wished everyone in her family to die. She said everything just as coldly. Oh, wow. Her hand tightly squeezed the bottle she had previously taken from the floor, bringing it above her in the air. Angelica said that before she died herself, she would send him to hell. A bottle of alcohol flew at him, shattering into small fragments and provoking a new explosion that engulfed the screaming Albert in flames. Throwing it away, she ran up to the bleeding Edward. She, trying to raise her ex-husband to his feet, said that she would get him out of here. Edward tried to dissuade her. He could not go. The flames grew. The heat was unbearable, and the building had only a few minutes left to stand. Angelica stubbornly raised Edward, declaring that she would not leave him here, thinking to herself that she could not remain in such debt to him. He gently took her hand and again asked for forgiveness for past debts, just for her to live. He didn't need anything more. He put her hand in his to his heart, hoping that she could forgive him before he died. Taking him upon herself and leading him to the exit, she called on him to stop talking nonsense. They would pay off their debts as soon as they got out of here, but the man asked her to leave her. She would die here because of him. He could barely walk leaning on it. It was hard to breathe from the smoke. A veil covered his eyes. Suddenly, with all his remaining strength, Edward pushed her forward, blocking her from the falling ceiling. A huge wooden beam, split from the fire, flew to the place where the girl stood. She sat on the floor, looking for Edward with her eyes. Everything ached in her chest. Why? Why did he do this? He lay unconscious on the floor, shouting his name. She tried to rouse him, feeling her consciousness leaving her. Her strength was leaving her, but she tried to force herself to breathe. The building was engulfed in more and more flames. The fire brigade arrived and began to extinguish the fire. When the door to the burning room was knocked down, Daniel jumped in and ran to the unconscious Angelica. He wrapped himself and her in a blanket, picked her up and carried her to the exit, shouting to the firemen that there was another person here, pointing at Edward. 4 years ago, Angelica found herself in a similar situation, which brought her to Edward. Terrorists seized a building in which there were many people. They shot indiscriminately, killing women and children. Angelica began to tremble with fear and heard them walking between the rows, talking so as not to leave anyone alive. Angelica sat behind the bench, covering her ears with her hands, trembling with panic. Her thought was, will she really die here today? What a pity. One of the invaders discovered her, throwing away the partition with the words that the beauty found you. Angelica screamed and was ready to say goodbye to life. When the man covered it with himself by standing in front of the terrorist with a weapon, she just sighed heavily, numb from the horror that gripped her. Then Edward saved her for the first time. That's how they met. She fell in love with him at first sight. She looked at him as if he were the same prince from fairy tales who saves the princess. This was their first meeting. He so bravely closed it with himself, risking his life. Edward became her hero, saving her from terrorists, and later, against all odds, she married him after living a miserable life in marriage. And this time, everything was modeled in a similar way. He saved her again. When Daniel carried her out of the room, he shouted for an ambulance to be called quickly. How worried he was that something might happen to Angelica. Edward lay in the room with his head bandaged. not yet regaining consciousness. Grace stood over her son, groaning at what he had done. Laura, out of anger, called her brother so stupid to risk his life because of this damned woman. Grace cursed Angelica. Because of her, Edward's whole body was damaged. Laura angrily said that since Angelica is now the president, let him come and take care of her brother, and generally work for their family. Old Grand, laughing contentedly, noticed that Laura had finally grown up and was speaking to the point. He rubbed his hands. There was a greedy light in her eyes. Let Edward and Angelica get married again, and all her inherited property become a dowry. The women supported the plan. This is a great idea. All her property will go to them, and they will become the richest family. Edward woke up to their conversations. He coughed, trying to stop them. His mother and sister vied with each other to ask him to get better. They would make sure that his kindness was paid in full, and Laura promised that she would be the one who would bring Angelique to her knees. Rising with difficulty, Edward said to leave Angelica alone. It was his personal choice. The grandfather, contentedly rubbing his beard without listening to his grandson, advised him to rest, and he would visit his ex. She seems to be in the next room. His family turned around and crowded towards Angelica to demand an explanation. Edward also began to get out of bed, ordering his assistant not to stand, but to help. He needed to catch up with his family. The brother fed Angelica from a spoon, trying to surround her with care. Anthony, almost sobbing, shared his impressions of the terrible picture that happened in that warehouse after her rescue. His voice trembled, tears welled up in his eyes. It would have been better if he had suffered instead of her. Out of emotions of revenge against his bastard uncle, he forced the spoon into her mouth so that she almost choked. His father hit him on the head from behind, pointing at Ange, who nearly choked. Angelica laughed cheerfully at all this, asking her father not to scold Anthony. He just takes care of her. He bit his lip and pitifully agreed with his sister. The father menacingly said that he forgives for the sake of his baby. Everyone laughed merrily, and meanwhile Eugene questioned the nurse in all seriousness. She advised leaving the patient in the hospital for several days. A lot of smoke got into her lungs. Then he approached the others, saying that the relative had stabbed them in the back with her abduction. If something had happened to her, the father would not have endured it. The girl cheerfully said that they should forget. Everything is already in the past. Then her gaze became serious and worried. She remembered Edward, who was also here in the hospital, and asked how he was. Anthony immediately jumped up, blaming her ex-husband for everything. If it weren't for his invitation, she wouldn't have had to suffer so much. But Eugene objected. Angelica was kidnapped by their relative, a member of their family, and Edward saved her at the risk of his life. But Anthony was unshakable. He is still not grateful to him. He is involved in what happened. Sanner suggested that everyone leave and give his sister a rest. Everyone agreed. The brothers wanted to spend more time with their sister, but the girl needed more rest and gain strength. When they left, Angelica looked at the branches of the tree, which was shrouded in rays of sunlight. This is how fate turned out. Due to random circumstances, she found herself in debt to Edward. Her thoughts were interrupted by footsteps and the loud opening of the chamber doors. The Grand family, led by the head, entered her room with a triumphant look. His eyes grinned, leaning on his cane. He said that his Edward suffered greatly because of her. She did not want to explain. The girl said, "So, it started. And what kind of explanation is Grandpa Grand waiting for?"